o governo fazendo injustiça, perseguindo os pobres e negando os direitos deles, pois cada autoridade é protegida pela que está acima dela, e as duas são acobertadas pelas autoridades superiores. Esse texto escrito por Salomão tem aproximadamente 2.900 anos. A percepção de Salomão é muito clara. Existe opressão, e a opressão se espalha. E muitas vezes essa opressão que se espalha é produzida pelas autoridades. Ou seja, aqueles que deveriam cuidar dos mais pobres, na verdade, não o fazem. E aí, então, Salomão diz algo que certamente nos incomoda muito em nossos dias. Uma autoridade encobre a outra. Que perigo nós vivemos quando a injustiça se espalha, inclusive naqueles instrumentos que deveriam ser usados para governar bem as sociedades. Salomão, como um rei, conhecia muito bem o que se passava dentro dos palácios, a política palaciana, e ele conhecia de fato essa política que levava muitas vezes ao sofrimento da nação. A questão toda para nós aqui do Mackenzie, e espero que vocês que estejam acompanhando conosco este momento devocional, é qual é a causa disso tudo? Sabemos que é um fato e que pode ser verificado, mas qual a causa? Salomão não só fez o diagnóstico da sua sociedade, mas ele foi um pouco mais a fundo procurando o que movia o coração dessas pessoas. 2 versículos após Salomão relatar os problemas sociais do seu tempo, ele diz assim: quem ama o dinheiro nunca ficará satisfeito. Quem tem a ambição de ficar rico nunca terá tudo o que quer. Isso também é ilusão. O que estava acontecendo na sociedade de Salomão é que as pessoas amavam aquilo que não deveria ser amado. E aqui eu tenho que me lembrar de Agostinho, que nos diz assim: se você quer conhecer alguém, não pergunte o que aquela pessoa faz, nem o que pensa. Pergunte o que ela ama. Uma sociedade de inclusão, de justiça, de amor, de graça, a mesma que Agostinho propôs na Cidade de Deus. Aquela que Salomão sonhou, mesmo num mundo de opressão, é uma sociedade onde as pessoas controlam o que se passa em seu coração. Então, de todas as preocupações, claro, políticas públicas são essenciais, mas nunca nos esqueçamos que por trás das políticas há um ser humano que também precisa ser tratado. Sucesso para vocês nessa empreitada. Ficarei um tempo aqui com vocês ainda e espero que seja um momento muito edificante a todos. Me permitam agora fazer uma oração. Quem desejar pode me acompanhar neste momento, usando a sua plena liberdade. Nós vamos falar com o Senhor, aquele que conhece os corações, que trabalhe no coração para mudar de fato o que precisa ser modificado, o ser humano. Obrigado, Senhor, pelo Mackenzie, pelas oportunidades que o Mackenzie nos dá, por esse evento extraordinário, que o Senhor nos dê clareza e ilumine a nossa mente, para que tenhamos um olhar cuidadoso para com aqueles que são excluídos ou oprimidos. Ajuda-nos, ó Deus, a neste olhar também alcançar o coração das pessoas, porque mais do que a força da lei, a força do amor é muito maior. Em nome de Jesus que oramos. Amém. Obrigado pela oportunidade. A chancelaria da Universidade Presbiteriana Mackenzie agradece. Nosso chanceler, reverendo Robinson Grangeiro, agradece. E obrigado também por esta oportunidade de fazer esse evento no Mackenzie. Devolvo a palavra para quem é de direito, mais uma vez, com meus votos de agradecimento.
Eu agradeço ao reverendo José Carlos Piacento pelo apoio, pelo prestígio que está dando a este evento. Agradeço também, na pessoa do reverendo, a toda a Universidade Presbiteriana Mackenzie, que nos deu apoio para a realização desse evento, inclusive ao MackPesquisa, nosso fundo Mackenzie de pesquisa. Então, agradeço muito e, com isso, nós vamos, então, dar início aos trabalhos. Muito obrigada, reverendo, por estar aqui conosco. Então, Eu vou apenas introduzir as instituições que estão aqui no evento, que participaram no seu comitê de elaboração, e na pessoa do professor Thomas Fogg, da Universidade de Yale, da professora Anna Bielitsky, da Universidade de Quinnipiac. Gostaria de dar uma palavra apenas a respeito do ASAP no Brasil, que está recebendo vocês hoje, juntamente com os outros membros aqui do comitê, para dar início, então, à nossa conferência a respeito com o tema Build Back Better. Então, passo a palavra imediatamente ao professor Thomas Fogg para fazer a sua saudação inicial e apresentar, então, a ASAP Global.
Yes, good morning, everybody. I represent the Global Justice Program at Yale University, and also I'm here as one of the representatives of ASAP Global, an organization that I helped co-found in about 10 years ago, a little more. Now, our organizations, both of them, are based on the recognition that that poverty is the slavery of our time. It is an injustice that ruins the lives of billions of people, and yet it is barely noticed by the affluent, rarely questioned by them. It is very highly normalized as a kind of natural fact of life that we have to get used to. Academics, I think, play a very big role in this normalization of poverty. They present it, first of all, as much less severe and much less widespread than it really is. They also always emphasize the progress that we have made, how we have lifted billions of people out of poverty, how we are saving hundreds of millions of children, rather than emphasizing how much poverty there still is. And finally, they like to present us as helpers. Poverty is a problem that is somewhere else, and we are involved, if we are involved at all, as potential helpers, as bystanders, as people who have contributed nothing to it, but do a lot in order to reduce it. All these standard views that are supported by academics are mistaken. Poverty is still massive. It is involved in about 1/3 of all human deaths worldwide. 1/3 of them are poverty related. People die from causes that occur only among the poor and not really elsewhere. Paradigm example is malnutrition or diarrhea. Poverty is totally avoidable today. You all know the statistic from Oxfam famously that 26 richest people in the world have as much wealth as the poorest half of the world's population. Here's another statistic. If you could shift just 3% of the wealth of the richest 1% of all humans, you would have $5.2 trillion, which is easily enough to wipe out all of poverty. 3% from the richest 1% of human beings would be enough to end poverty. And yet half the human population still suffers very severe deprivations, and deprivations that are in the catalog of human rights. So for example, several 100 million, 700 million officially, but probably twice as much in reality, are chronically undernourished. 2 billion lack access to essential medicines. More than 2 billion lack access to safe drinking water. 1.6 billion lack adequate shelter. About 1 billion lack electricity. 2 billion lack adequate sanitation. And about 750 million adults are illiterate, and 150 million children do wage work outside of their own family. So it is a very massive problem. Progress has been rather slow. And even though everybody takes credit for this progress, much of it is just the side effect of ordinary economic growth. People basically do very little about poverty, people being governments and people in rich countries. And then when progress invariably occurs as a consequence of growth, they celebrate themselves, slap on their own shoulders and say, look, we lifted people out of poverty. We saved millions of children because it's gotten a little better than it was before. Again, the relevant fact is that all severe poverty today is entirely avoidable, and academics can play a major role in highlighting what the problem of poverty really is all about, how avoidable it is, how large it is, and then finally also how we are deeply involved in its perpetuation, especially through the supranational institutions that we continue to uphold that are designed with tender loving care by the rich for the rich. They benefit us, major corporations, banks, hedge funds, and so on, those who can influence supranational institutional design. And of course, the larger a share of the global product these rich and privileged forces acquire for themselves, the less is left over for the global poor. Anyway, this is the kind of work that inspires ASAP and also the Global Justice Program. We are trying to build on an existing network that of academics around the world, a well-resourced, well-established network, and trying to use some of the strength and capabilities of this network for poverty eradication for the poor, rather than as usual in an effort to normalize poverty and make it appear that everything is already being done and nobody needs to worry about it. Thank you very much.
Agradeço. Agradeço as palavras do professor Thomas Pogg e passo a palavra a Anat Biletsky.
Thank you so much.
Fazer a sua saudação inicial.
Thank you. I represent here one of the institutions hosting this conference, the Albert Schweitzer Institute at Quinnipiac University. The institute is named for Albert Schweitzer, who, as we all know, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1952 for his humanitarian efforts and commitment to social, economic, and political development. He was a musician, a philosopher, a theologist, a doctor. He was, of course, most famous for the hospital that he built in Lambaréné in what is now Gabon. It was then a French colony. His name and his humanitarian aura are what act as the basis for the Institute's interests and activities relating to various subjects and agendas. And I'm speaking here of a goal that we all have, I think, in the institutions that we're related to and affiliated with, the goal of educating students on questions that have to do with, as Thomas said, poverty, if I break it up more to food security, the environment, indigeneity, peace, human rights, all of those slogans. We're supported at Quinnipiac by an enthusiastic leadership that has proclaimed its commitment to advance racial justice and to stand fast for dignity, fairness, equality. The Albert Schweitzer Institute is the fulcrum of interest at the university for the type of engagement that is relevant for academic stand against poverty, and for the global justice conferences that we have been sponsoring and hosting with the Yale Global Justice Program for several years now. And now we have Mackenzie with us. Now, this year's conference could have been one more conference in that line. Our interest in the injustices of the real world of politics and economics, along with the philosophical need to be analytical and critical, could have easily populated one more conference. We could have called it Global Justice, Equality, Liberty, Human Rights in the old mold. However, I think that this year has become a different year. When devising the themes that we could elaborate on, when we said reducing vulnerabilities or strengthening justice, we realized that the most outstanding topics and foci of many, so to speak, essential questions were contextually weighted, the context being our places, our times, and our current crises. So the themes of this year's conference cannot but deal with the environmental crisis now so much with us, with the COVID-19 crisis now almost paralyzing us, or with questions of historical oppression, colonialism, and racism today. By the way, Albert Schweitzer, even today, is easily branded a colonialist, if not even a racist. So we invite you to spend 4 days with us being challenged and invigorated by these issues of our times and our places that give us no peace. Being philosophers, some of us believe that it's not the answers to questions that should tax us, but rather the search for the right questions. In times of crisis like those that we're at now, it's the questions that we ask and grappling with them that might guide us in building back better. So I am really happy to have us all here together and try to build back better. Thank you so much.
I suppose this is the time for the first panel. Clarice?
Yes. Desculpem. E sim, eu vou então só dar uma pequena palavra, uma palavra rápida a respeito da ASAP Brasil. A ASAP Brasil surgiu em 2013, numa conferência realizada em dezembro. Desde então, nós temos realizado algumas conferências a cada 2 anos. Sempre tivemos o apoio do Mackenzie, do MackPesquisa, desde a 2ª conferência, após o lançamento. E eu gostaria apenas de dar uma palavra a respeito da nossa prioridade no Brasil, na ASAP Brasil, em investigar as causas que têm, não apenas as iniciativas de enfrentamento à pobreza no Brasil, temos um foco pela via do direito, buscando compreender as razões pelas quais o padrão de proteção social que nós alcançamos no país, especialmente após a Constituição de 1988, ele vem sendo historicamente incapaz de sustentar uma política permanente de desenvolvimento econômico com proteção social. Apesar das bases, né, de um Estado social desenvolvimentista terem sido lançadas no Brasil desde a década de 30, foi só a partir da Constituição de 88 que o papel do direito na superação da pobreza assumiu um papel de maior destaque. Mas, ainda assim, ele não conseguiu, então, por conta do nosso legado escravista, aliado a uma cultura marcada pelo predomínio da vontade privada sobre o interesse público e pela defesa de privilégios arraigados, nós não conseguimos, então, criar um padrão permanente que chame cada um a sua responsabilidade de combate à pobreza no país. Apesar dos avanços, sobretudo na década de 2000, de 2003 a 2014, que nós tivemos tanto em relação à diminuição, à redução da pobreza e também da desigualdade no país, esses padrões não foram suficientes, então, para que houvesse uma continuidade, e hoje em dia nós estamos, antes mesmo da pandemia do Covid-19, nós já estávamos assistindo a um retrocesso em relação a todas as conquistas que foram atingidas anteriormente. Então, esse é um dos grandes temas que orientam as nossas pesquisas no Brasil, tentar compreender as razões disso e interferir nesse debate político para que o desmonte do Estado social e democrático de direito que nós vimos assistindo no país seja revertido. Então, esse é um dos grandes desafios que nós temos, especialmente num contexto agora em que essas desigualdades passam a ser agravadas e estão escancaradas aos olhos de todos nós. Então, nesse contexto, um dos grandes objetivos da ASAP Brasil é contribuir para esse debate e reforço do papel dos estados sociais do welfare state no Brasil e no mundo. Então, com isso, eu passo a palavra ao professor e meu colega Daniele Botti, também para fazer a sua saudação, introdução, e já moderar a próxima mesa. Muito obrigada.
Thank you, Clarissa. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where you are. I am in New Haven, Connecticut. I am from Italy. I teach philosophy and political theory at Quinnipiac University. And I have the privilege this morning here to moderate, not chair, but moderate, and I will make an effort to stay back and convey the questions and the comments of the audience to our distinguished speakers. And before we start, my proposal is that of having the speakers presenting separately and having Q&A after each presentation, because not all of our speakers can remain until the end of this 3-hour-long panel. This panel is about COVID-19 and its unequal impacts. Our first very distinguished speaker is a privilege and an honor for me to introduce Professor Pistor to the audience. Katharina Pistor will present a lecture on law as unequalizer, on the distributional effects of law in times of crisis. Professor Pistor is Edwin B. Parker Professor of Comparative Law at Columbia Law School and Director of the Law School Center on Global Legal Transformation. Her research and teaching spans corporate law, corporate governance, money and finance, property rights, comparative law, and law and development. She has published widely in legal and interdisciplinary journals and is the author and co-author of more than, I would say 20, maybe 19 books. She's the recipient of the Max Planck Research Award 2012 and several grants, among others, the Institute for New Economic Thinking and the National Science Foundation. The most recent book is titled The Code of Capital: How the Law Creates Wealth and Inequality. This is published by Princeton University Press in 2019. I would let Professor Pistor give her lecture, and which is again titled Law as Unequalizer, on the distributional effects of law in times of crisis, in the hope to have a Q&A moment starting perhaps a few minutes before 10. But well, let's see how it.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction. I will share my screen here so that you can see my PowerPoints. So I just wanted to put this a little bit in perspective. I will talk about COVID, but I think I first want to lay the foundations as to why I'm saying that law is an unequalizer. I'm basically saying even in normal times, law operates as unequalizer, even when we assume formal equality before the law and unrealistically a fairly even distribution of wealth. When we do neither, of course, the effect of law as an unequalizer become aggravated. The reason is that law ranks rights, enforces stronger versus weaker rights. And the relative strength of these rights is non-random. That's critical. So we have to think about how stronger rights are created and why some folks have stronger and others have weaker rights, and who sets these rights. So I think there's nothing fundamentally wrong about having stronger rights or weaker rights, but the key question is who's behind that, and how are the allocation of rights, how is the allocation of rights legitimated in society? In times of crisis, individuals or entities survive better, have a greater chance of surviving if they have stronger rights and can enforce them, if they have access to support, such as in financial systems, unlimited liquidity support from central banks, from the most powerful central banks in the world, or if they are the beneficiaries of state intervention, and now comes the irony here, if states intervene and sometimes suspend or relax the full force of the law that otherwise makes debtors so dependent on their creditors and can drive debtors into despair, because sometimes the policymakers, legislatures, or even courts intervene and declare debt moratoria or creditor bailouts, or facilitate liquidity provisioning, even where there's no legal reason or has been no legal reason ex ante. So in times of crisis, we always see a lot of discretion come in, but the question is, again, for whose benefit is the discretionary power of the state then exercised to relax the binding forces of the law that in times of crisis can bring the entire system to its knees? I will say more about this later. So we typically assume formal equality before the law. We do this in particular in constitutional law. I'm more interested in private law. And so I'm basically saying not all rights are equal. Some have priority rights, stronger rights than others. That's what law does. So, I would say more about the details in a second. In my book that has been mentioned, The Code of Capital, I basically say that capital assets have a handful of attributes. The three most important perhaps are priority, that is that you have stronger rights vis-a-vis others, durability, that you can insulate your assets against too many different claimants, too many different creditors. Convertibility is a kind of an insurance device that allows you to flip your assets into a safer asset, typically the legally issued tender of a powerful state, that is dollars or yen or pounds, maybe euros, but not necessarily, let's say, pesos of Venezuela or other countries that have problems supporting their currencies. So, and if these rights are enforced against the world and are made universal, then you have a powerful right to defend elsewhere, to defend them. And last but not least, of course, if you are building your wealth and your power around legal institutions, you want to have access to courts if necessary. So the rules that determine who has standing to bring a case in court and the resources to pay your lawyers up front or pay even the legal cost matter, unless you have contingency fees or other conditions. But let's just leave this aside for now. So when we rank rights in private law, if you just look around, you can immediately see this. We have property rights that are stronger than contractual rights. We have secured creditors that have stronger rights than unsecured creditors. We have creditors versus debtors, and we have come to a point where creditors have fortified their rights much more so than debtors have rights to defend themselves. This has not always been the case. It's very much a question of political economy, how the relative allocation of rights and responsibility pans out. We have controlling shareholders versus minority owners in business organizations. We have shareholders versus other stakeholders, that is, employees or creditors or the community, the environment in corporate law, and we have priority rules in bankruptcy. So wherever you look, once you look for the ranking of rights in private law, you can find it. And I think it's always important to ask, who made that decision? How did we get here? And what implications does it have for those on the other side? So it's basically like having a deck of cards and pulling out the ace or pulling out the joker and being able to win the legal game in that fashion. That is really important. There's also a possibility to recreate many of the rankings that you can find in law through contractual arrangements. and information technology that allows us to contract with millions of people at the same time on the same terms has made it all the much easier for those who control the contract at the outset to impose their own preferred rank orders and contractual obligations on the rest of the world. So you're all familiar, I'm sure, with Anatole France's famous dictum that folks, are equally empowered to sleep under the bridges. Sorry, this is so both the rich and the poor can sleep under the bridges. But this is, if we add that, then what I'm saying becomes all the more important. But I also want to make the point that even if we control for the vastly unequal allocation of resources, the law actually structurally reinforcing inequality. And I think the two, of course, go together. If you have stronger rights, you're more likely to accumulate wealth over time and protect it in the future. If you're poorer, you are much more exposed to the vulnerabilities of economic cycles, and you won't be able to defend your rights unless you get explicit help from these institutions later on. Okay. So for whose benefit are we ordering? There is sort of an assumption very often in the social sciences and political discourse on a daily basis that private legal ordering in markets and in the economy takes place within parameters that are set by state law, that we have an enumerated set of property rights, and that we have clear conditions for what we recognize as an enforceable contract. And that's what we also teach our law school students in their first year, that property rights are enumerated, and then contracts have to meet certain conditions to be enforceable in law. But in fact, these parameters are much more flexible and malleable in the hands of sophisticated lawyers. And we have pushed the system pretty hard to be able to recreate at least the semblance of property rights through private contractual mechanisms, and to get courts to recognize other legal institutions or other claims as property-like, so that we have actually outsourced to private parties the ability to create their own superior rights and enforce them against others. And there are fundamental reasons for that, even outside the political economy. One is that law is, of course, inherently incomplete. It is malleable, also meant to be malleable, so that you can organize your private affairs. So not everything is, from the outset problematic, but these are the entry doors, if you wish, that you can use sort of to capture the law and make it malleable for your own purposes. And the techniques are well known to any lawyer. We make analogy arguments, we fill gaps in the law with, of course, certain types of interest. We combine different legal modules to create something completely new. And of course, there's a lot of power of legal reasoning. And of course, where the end of legal reasoning is something that is subject to debate. Last but not least, we have made it increasingly easy for sophisticated parties to choose the law by which they wish to be governed. These are the choice of law rules or conflict of law rules. So I can use the laws of the neighboring states in the United States, where I never want to do business, but I like the laws better because they support my interest. I can do this even globally because most states now recognize and enforce the laws of other countries, even if the business who choose them have never set foot there. And of course, last but not least, and I said this before, access to legal services is important in a world that is so deeply coded in legal rights and privileges. Okay, let me just... So how do we protect one's rights in private law? How do we defend ourselves against that? One important thing to realize in private law is that we don't have a state that polices private law. And it's basically up to other private parties to police private law. And so we have a powerful first mover advantage built in the creation of private legal rights and privileges. I can basically try to do a private transaction. I create a new type of legal institutional arrangement for my client as a lawyer and let him run with it. I, of course, check case law, I check statutory law, I check regulation to make sure that what I create fits through the gaps of the scaffolding that is the legal system as we know it, so that I can give a comparative advantage to my client, hoping that he does not infringe the law. If this is struck down a couple of years later, that's too bad. But then at least the client has made some money in between. And of course, as a lawyer, I'm trying to protect him from being struck down. And that's, of course, the sophistication that goes into transactional lawyering these days. So the real issue is that on the other side, if you're arguing that your rights have been infringed by somebody else, that the contract should not be enforceable against you, you're always playing defense. And you carry the burden of playing defense. You have to bring a case to court, you have the burden of proof, you have to find the evidence that suggests that there has been wrongdoing, and of course you face the cost of litigation. Same basically for regulators. We have of course established in many countries regulators that police a little bit on the fringes, I would say, behavior, whether it's antitrust, financial regulation and other things. But most of the action, I would argue, is really happening in the space of private law, where private actors would have to raise a flag first before maybe down the road, after a major crisis, we establish regulation that tries to rectify some of these issues. So one thing that has happened over time, and increasingly so during the last several decades, is that we have tightened the legal commitments we make in private law, in part because there was a great desire to scale legal relations, economic relations beyond, of course, localities, beyond the nation state to the global level. And that basically means we have to make rigid contractual commitment that become tradable assets in their own right. So you can think of legal relations on a continuum from relational contracts. Of course, there could be relations that don't even have a legal aspect, but we can still have relational contracts where two parties know that they are sort of dependent on each other, and therefore also might renegotiate their contractual relationship in the future if something substantially different happens in their environment. Then we can move to a stage where we want to really make credible commitment and minimize the prospect of anybody renegotiating a contract. So we make them binding, but we allow some exceptions. We could say something is a force majeure event, something is an exceptional event no party had anticipated, and we adjust or renegotiate the contract later. What is a force majeure event, of course, is a big question and has been battled out also in the COVID crisis. Some force majeure clauses in major merger agreements did not even recognize a pandemic as a force majeure event. So you can't get out of a contract under those conditions either. And then last but not least, if you really want to have a financial asset that you can sell easily in major financial markets, you want to have a binding commitment that doesn't allow for renegotiation. So just to illustrate this in another way, if you think of a creditor and borrower, and you think of a bank that gives loans to different types of borrowers, the bank to some extent becomes increasingly dependent on these borrowers actually to pay back. But this also means that it might be willing to renegotiate a loan to make sure that it will get the money back eventually, even if not under the terms of the original contract, then eventually. The downside of this arrangement, of course, is that the risk is concentrated in the bank, which is why we regulate banks, which is why we're saying banks have to keep equity and have to make sure that they can absorb some of the losses before they fail themselves. But what actors in the private financial world have tried to do is basically to recreate banking relationship through private law mechanisms outside banks. And the way to do this was to make really the contractual relations that we make ever more binding, ever more rigid. So the marketization of financial relation has gone hand in hand with the rigidity of the contracts that we use to create them, because otherwise we can't trade these assets in global financial markets, as I said before. So we have basically unpacked a bank into a chain of contractual relations. Here's the debtor. This could be a homeowner. It could be somebody who leases a car. It can be a little firm that needs sort of bridge finance, and rather than going to a bank, might be able to access financial markets in a different way. You have a loan originator that might originate multiple loans to multiple debtors, sell them to a buyer. The buyer then sets up a trust. So you have a trust sponsor that sets up a trust, which is a legal creature that protects these assets behind the trust, inside the trust, from too many different creditors. That's the durability function I mentioned earlier. The trust then sells interest in the trust to investors. The investors very often have their own creditors, and the creditors, of course, have their own owners. Now, this is highly, highly simplified at every stage here. With the investors, you of course also have owners in addition to creditors. So I could elaborate this more, but I just wanted to show that from the bank, which is sort of the bubble in the middle, you get a chain of contractual relations, and how these contractual relations are built is important to look at. Now, we can take out some of these elements here, and in fact, the law is used to basically marginalize the loan originator, the wholesale buyer, and the trust sponsor, so that the investors who buy assets in the trust don't have to think about whether these guys are viable. All we want to think about is that there are enough debtors that make regular payments on their loans that go into the trust, and then the investors get what they want to get. And what the investors want to get are fixed payments. They don't want to basically carry the risk of payments that change on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. They want fixed returns. And of course, once you have fixed returns, you can see how this tightens the system, because if the debtors don't always pay, then the ability to pay these fixed returns, of course, becomes a problem. The investors then also have fixed returns to be paid to their creditors, and the creditors might have owners who have redemption rights. And if they have redemption rights, they could at any moment ask to get their money back, exactly the amounts that they have paid in. And you can see how this can then destabilize the entire system. So we have created a system increasingly, and not only in the United States, you can see this globally. You can see this also for sovereign debt relations, for project finance, syndication of loans. Many of them use securitization and similar structures to lower the cost of credit on the left-hand side. But this comes, and this is the flip side of the coin, this comes at the cost of contractual rigidity and a strong creditor bias, because this works only from the point of view of the creditors, that they're saying, we always say they diversify their risk, but it basically means that they tighten the screws on the debtors. Now, I've written about this earlier in a paper called The Legal Theory of Finance, where I've basically said we need these tight legal commitments to build financial systems, but under conditions of fundamental uncertainty that we can't escape, and liquidity volatility. The two are related. The system can self-destroy. When the system sort of approaches the abyss and might self-destroy, it can be rescued by relaxing the full force of the underlying legal commitment, which can take different forms. It could be a bailout, a moratorium. It could also be offering liquidity to some, but not all, when no liquidity is owed. Somebody who has never paid for the regulation or for insurance, but then gets the insurance from the state. And of course, that's what happened when we did our quantitative easing programs and other bailout mechanisms. So when you look at what happens, it's not necessarily what has to happen, but I think it's built into our system. When you look at what happens in rescue efforts, it's typically that the central banks of powerful countries tend to rescue the entities and actors that are critical for the survival of the system, but not the rest. So there's a hierarchy of relations built into the financial system. Financial systems are hierarchical. Harry Merling has written a lot about this. And you can see this literally when you look in financial crisis, who gets the benefit of central bank intervention. These are entities that have already institutional access to central banks, like regulated banks. That's fine. It becomes more problematic when other entities that have not been regulated, but that are now deemed too big or too interdependent to fail, also benefit from that or beyond that. So you can look at this in the 2008 crisis. You can also look at this in the COVID crisis. I will come back to that, is how quick central banks, especially the Fed, can intervene and make liquidity available to asset holders, including holders of bonds or even corporate shares in the most recent crisis, to make sure that the system survives. But this has, of course, massive distributional effect, just the rescue action as such, when you give the support to some but not to the rest. So in a market-based credit system, this is the same slide I showed you earlier. What the central bank is basically doing is trying to address this problematic cycle where we have fixed interest that can no longer be served because you might have too high default rates by the debtors. And so when everybody else is now scrambling to see whether they have the cash flow they need to meet their own creditors, this can bring the entire system down if also the perception changes, and we all know we cannot enforce all the contracts. So that's where central banks basically go in and they offer liquidity in this cycle. What they do not do, or do much later, typically, I'll come back to the COVID crisis in a second, is to think about what's happening on the debtor front. And for the system to survive, the continuing performance of as many debtors as possible is critical, because otherwise the state has to intervene even more to protect the others. But each individual debtor is not deemed to be systemically important for the system as such. And that basically means that we enforce. We enforce on the periphery of the system, but we relax the full force of the law at the core, at the apex of the system, and that basically reinforces the hierarchy and leads to even greater concentration. It is basically only, when we reach a point where we have either social crisis or political crisis when this stops. And there are lots of examples in history when we've seen that you have sometimes in colonial India, it has been reported that the eviction of peasants led to mutinies and so forth. We see this less today, but I think we have to brace ourselves in the next month. Once this credit cycle, the debt cycle plays itself out, what happens with evictions, what happens with households and small firms that cannot pay their business. So let me just turn to COVID briefly, and just to, again, also think about the amounts of dollars that have been made available to different constituencies. So this is basically just tracking the COVID response. More money has been made available than has been actually spent. This is just for the United States. It would be interesting to just trace that more systematically for different countries around the world. What you can see here is that, of course, the Federal Reserve has the greatest ability to spend, and these are authorized amounts. On top of that, the Federal Reserve can also issue additional liquidity at its own behest. It basically has no limit. It doesn't have a binding budget constraint in that sense, because the US controls the dollar and they can issue as many dollars as they need to rescue the system to fulfill their mandate of price stability. They also have a mandate for unemployment, but that is usually subdued or subordinated to the idea of making sure there's price stability. We have legislative action, and what is interesting to note, I think, is that not all the money that had been appropriated has actually been spent, and that has different reasons. Here's a little bit of a sense where the money went, or where it should have gone. One thing that has become apparent is that small and medium-sized enterprises, for example, have not received all the money that they could have potentially received. And this is, again, related to the structure of the system, because many of these, the mechanism for small and medium-sized enterprises to access the dollars is to get loans from banks, because the Fed lends to banks, and then the banks lend to small and medium-sized enterprise. I'm just going to open this all up so I can walk you through this. So what we see in a time of crisis like COVID, and this is for the US, it's also true for Europe. I'm sure it's also true to some extent in Brazil and other countries that control their own currencies, where you can have immediate liquidity provisioning by central banks. They go in and are the first firefighters to make sure that the asset holders and intermediaries survive the onslaught of a crisis. In the US, the Fed also has played a substantial role in facilitating liquidity for states and municipalities. That was new. That hasn't been done before, and it might suggest that the Fed will play a more active role here in the future. But this was basically an emergency response. The CARES Act was critically important, and other countries have made similar interventions, but note that many of these interventions were temporary and didn't address the underlying structural issues, which is indebtedness. So I can have a temporary income support for household, I can have a temporary eviction moratorium, I can have lending programs to firms, but of course loans have to be paid back again, right? Maybe on slightly different terms than what you can get in the market, but you're basically levering up. And at some point, all the amounts of money that you haven't paid as the crisis went on are accumulated and very often compounded with interest, and then you have to pay them back. It's also important to note that many of the tax breaks that had been budgeted for were conditioned on protecting employees, and many of these tax breaks have not been taken up by, especially by small and medium-sized enterprises, but also by others, because the cost of maintaining employees were deemed too high. Now, there are different ways, of course, of intervening. In Europe, very often the government picked up the wages, although recent reports suggest that this is also, sorry about this, recent reports suggest that the stress at the firm level is building there as well. So I think what we're seeing here in times of crisis is there are two things are happening. One is really that the contractual and legal structures that we built in normal times that make certain assumptions about how the future will pan out, but also that built into the structures, the expectation of the side that has the stronger bargaining power and has a stronger control over the law means that we create really rigid binding commitments at the lower end in a hierarchical system. And that if at all, when we get into a crisis, the full force of the law is suspended at the top, not necessarily at the bottom, or only later at the bottom, or only temporarily at the bottom. And by these rescue efforts that basically reinforce the structural differences that we built in law beforehand, we're reinforcing the inequalities that we have in the system. So I might be a little faster than you had anticipated, but maybe this gives us a little bit more time for questions and answers. So let me just come to my concluding comments to reiterate, not all legal rights are equal. And I think we really have to come to terms with the fact that in the private market, we are sort of bargaining over rights to some extent, or we're certainly in a situation where parties know how to create powerful rights and make others commit to these rights. Most of us are rule takers, not rule makers. We click agree when we agree to a contract on the internet, of course, but most contracts in the consumer world have been standardized and you sign them without reading because you can't really change them at all. So, and what is in these contracts is ultimately always matters in times of crisis. It always matters in times of default, and that's when we start thinking about how these rights have been created beforehand. You can basically go back into history and trace the allocation of stronger and weaker rights over centuries in different systems. It certainly is the case that in the UK, until the end of the 19th century, landowners had stronger rights than their creditors. But the same English Parliament that upheld that until the end of the 19th century changed the law in the United States in 1732, 150 years earlier, to make sure that the English creditors in the US could enforce against the landowners. So political economy, power relations matter hugely in how you allocate the rights between creditors and debtors, landowners and creditors. And we've seen certainly over the course of the 20th and 21st century a massive increase of the rights of creditors and a huge dependency of debtors on receiving debt for reasons that have to do with wage levels, etc., but also the legal relationship they have with their creditors, as I explained. The propensity to survive a crisis is strongly correlated, therefore, with the strength of legal rights that one holds vis-a-vis others, and whether or not one is a beneficiary of the relaxation of binding legal commitments. So there's an irony here, right? Is that very often those who impose highly binding commitments on the rest of us are also the ones who are most likely to be the beneficiaries of the relaxation or suspension of the full force of the law in times of crisis. And this is how the system gets reinforced and inequalities even increase. The governmental interventions or the crisis remedies may mitigate, in theory they could mitigate some of the structural effects if they're designed well. That means if we also try to rescue folks on the periphery, even though they might not be systemically important for the system, but it's a moral claim to make sure that we distribute our resources well for those who are actually most in need of them, but very often, as I suggest, the disparities are being deepened rather than mitigated, and by protecting the core but not the periphery. The most powerful equalizer, unfortunately, might very likely be to allow the system to destroy itself. We've seen this in the 1930s. If the system self-destroys, then the level of the inequality in society declines rapidly. Now it can, of course, increase again afterwards. But of course, the political and social costs of such a self-destruction of the system, which is inevitable given how the system has been coded beforehand, are such that nobody really wants to incur them. And I don't want to advocate for that, but I just want to show the irony of basically supporting a system and backing a system through the coercive powers of the state effectively that has these features, that builds a system that has a high propensity to self-destroy. And the only way we can rescue it from the self-destruction is to suspend the full force of the law. And if we do this in this highly unequal fashion, in which we have been doing that, we are reinforcing the very structures that should be changed. So let me leave it here and take some questions perhaps, and I will stop sharing so we can see each other. Let me see how I can do this.
Thank you very much, Professor Pistor. This was enlightening, instructive, and well, I learned a good deal from it. I am not familiar with legal studies and law. And I already see a question there. I had something in mind. I was wondering, if I may, before conveying the question, I was wondering how the notion of corporate personhood in the United States play into this dialectic. As you mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, what we teach, or what you teach usually to the students, is that the private law it originates and works within the framework of our state-made architecture. And this is something that you are questioning, and you are talking more about an horizontal kind of a dialectic there, in which private law has an impact on the architecture itself. And so I was wondering if, considering corporate personhood, we can even talk about a vertical dialectic in which there is actually private law that is shaping and dictating the terms of and it is probably linked to the question of Sergio Chaparro.
Shall I answer first yours?
Yes.
Yes, I mean, as I said, private legal institutions are meant to rank rights among private parties, and private parties avail themselves of state power to do exactly that. They do this with property rights. They do this also by choosing different organizational forms for their business. And of course, a legal person can be created only under the rules of the law, because it's a fiction. It doesn't exist in nature. Such as intellectual property rights don't exist in nature. Financial assets don't exist in nature. We create them in law, and how we create them is critical. Now, the states have allowed private parties to simply register a legal person with minimal requirements. So in the state in Delaware, where most companies are registered these days, it takes a few hours if you pay the right fee to an agent to incorporate an entity. You just need an address, you need a certificate of incorporation, one page, and you pay the registration fee basically, and name, an address, name, that's it. And then you have a legal person, and that allows you, this goes back to what I said earlier, now you can transfer some of your assets to the legal person, and now the legal person owns them, so that your own creditors cannot access these assets. So I can use this legal person. Now it becomes more sophisticated. You can design your relationships with employees, with directors, with other constituencies. So this is one of these institutions that has become highly malleable in the hands of private parties. That started in the 19th century. In the 19th century, still you had to get either an act passed by a state legislature, or you had to get government approval to set up a corporation. Today, you can do this very easily. And on top of that, this is really important, you can choose in which jurisdiction you want to incorporate your entity. And that very entity, even though it's a creature of that jurisdiction, will be recognized as a legal entity almost anywhere else in the world. which is why you can be in Delaware and never do business in Delaware, operate only in California or in Israel or somewhere else in the world or in Italy, and benefit from the rather pro-managerial and shareholder-friendly law of Delaware while you do business elsewhere.
Thank you. Well, I only see, I am not aware if I am looking at the right place, but I think I am. And in the Q&A box here, I have one question. Yes, I see questions coming in. So let me convey the first one. I think I should read it for the audience. Sergio Chaparro asks, is it possible to invert the hierarchy of finance using law under a capitalist economy? In other words, is it the constitutive role of law autonomous enough from material constraints to think law can prioritize the interests of actors at the bottom of the pyramid?
So I think law can do this. The big question is, can law do this in the capitalist system? And this is, you know, a little bit tautology in my world, because I've argued in my book, The Code of Capital, that capital is coded in law, right? That a particular way in which we have used these institutions, property rights and our debt contracts, the trust, the corporate entity, the bankruptcy, has always sort of created hierarchies and created new types of power relations. Could law be used in different fashion? Yes. Would this still be a capitalist system? Probably not, because in my world, capital is the essence of capitalism is really to be able to harness the powers of the state in the form of law to create more powerful rights for some, which they can exercise over others. So. But you can mitigate it. I mean, we've seen more moderate forms of capitalism, at least in the past. If you think about the big debates we had in the 60s and 70s about the Rhine model or the varieties of capitalism, so you can mitigate the beast by making it less easy for private parties to avail themselves of the law in this fashion. But I think in a latent fashion, this hierarchy, these some having better rights and being able to use the law to create them even more, and in a highly competitive way in which the law itself becomes the stuff that we are competing about, that is, I think, built into the capitalist system as we know it.
Thank you. I do have a question which appears unclear to me, perhaps due to a typo in the question. Nayana Shirado is asking, what I suppose the question is, what is the best social program, or if the best social program is that of creating jobs? I don't understand really well this question, but
I don't quite follow this either, but maybe she can retype. Yes. Let me just say that, you know, we could, of course, and lots of people are arguing this, that in the COVID context, the government should play a much more forceful role in creating jobs, and maybe in general there should be a governmental job guarantee. That would help, because you would basically guarantee households and future income flow, even in times of crisis. And that would allow them then to, you know, pay their bills, pay their debt, and do everything else. It doesn't really mitigate the structural features of the system entirely, but it would certainly be of help, let's put it this way.
Right.
Could I ask a question?
Yes, you can, Thomas.
Okay, I cannot type it into the Q&A because I'm one of the speakers, so I'm sorry for that. What interests me, you spoke very elaborately about the system and how the system works, and I would like to learn a little bit more about how the system evolves, how the system changes over time, what shapes the system. So at one extreme, you might imagine that it is very explicitly shaped by politicians, legislators, and so on. They create a certain legal framework. And I'm sure there's something to that. And of course, these legislators don't operate in a vacuum. They get influenced and lobbied and so on and so forth. But then from what you said, there's also a good bit of just practice that shapes the system. Of course, legal practice, and also the individual players who make certain contracts with each other. Anyway, if you could speak to that problem a little bit more, that would be very interesting, I think.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point in my view, is that I think sometimes we think too much of the state basically framing the system, and then everybody plays within that system. And if we change from the state legislature or even the regulatory side, something that the system will change. When you look at the private law side and how people transact, private lawyers will tell you that they basically look at the legislature or the regulation as the scaffolding. And in order to help their clients get a competitive advantage over anybody else, you have to build a new type of transaction or financial intermediary that fits within the gaps of that scaffolding. So it has to be legal, can't be illegal because then it fails, but it has to be legal but not incur the legal costs that come with the legislation or the regulation. How does the system evolve? In my book, I talk about the masters of the code. And I'm basically saying that the private attorneys are the masters of the code. And you can, so we can trace this, especially in the common laws. I think the common law has a comparative advantage in that sense that it has empowered private attorneys to engage in these transactional law, and the judges who might oversee the transactions that have been created are recruited from the bar. They're coming from private legal practice. They first practice a couple of decades, then they become judges. So the likelihood that they will recognize and enforce the latest legal innovation of their former peers is much greater than in a civilian system where you have bureaucrats sitting as judges. So I think there's a very strong common law legacy here, history of an independent legal profession that has helped individual clients to build their wealth through using these legal devices, and they have been highly competitive. If you look at the world today, we all know that the biggest financial intermediaries are sitting in London and New York, and there's some competitors coming up, but they're still sitting there largely. But in London and New York, you also have the biggest top 100 global law firms that have offices in more than one jurisdiction. So this goes hand in hand, and they're basically coding the interests of their client, and they're choosing the jurisdictions that give them the greatest flexibility to do that. And these are typically the laws of England or the laws of the United States. They're very often used also in global context. So I'm basically arguing that most globally traded assets are actually coded in these jurisdictions. And this is possible because most other countries do recognize and enforce the laws of England or the United States or of Delaware or of New York. And so you can pick and choose. You can pick and choose the laws by which you want to be governed, and that undermines this whole notion that we as democracies adopt legislation by which we're governed, because if you know how to opt out of that, then you can free yourself from that state. You're still dependent on a state to code your legal assets, but it doesn't have to be that one state, and then you can shift around. We know this from tax evasion, but it's actually, we know this from regulatory arbitrage. That's how we do this, right? And the more we rely, and the more of our wealth is created through legal issues, legal things such as patents or corporations or financial assets, the more we can actually use the law itself to recreate the system. And I think that's where we are.
Thank you. I have two questions. I will read the second one first because it's probably a little bit more related to what we are discussing at this point. Reda Mokhtar El-Ftou, sorry for the pronunciation, is saying, thank you very much for this incredible presentation. And the question is, could job income guarantee and monetary financing help escape the structural aspects of the system that produce inequality, or could they contribute to reinforcing them even more?
Well, it depends. I take this a little bit to be a question about sort of the modern monetary theory. So we're basically using the power to issue money to ensure that we can harness the full productive capacity of the economy, including employees in particular. So the binding constraint, then, as folks like Stephanie Kelton and others argue, is then inflation rather than something like a deficit myth. And I think one important issue here is that we would at least get out of this spiral of thinking and acting in terms of debt dependencies, right? This is one of the big political debates, especially in this country, but has been in Germany. It seems to be shifting in Germany as well with the black zero. I think we're beyond that now, that the state itself is perceived or portrayed as an ordinary debtor that has to balance its balance sheet. If we get over that, then the state has more flexibility to use its resource. And one of the most powerful resources is to have your own currency that you can issue, and you can force others to use it because you tax them. So they need to have that currency to pay back the obligations they owe to you, and that's how you make sure that people actually use your currency, at least those over which you have control. Can you completely revamp the system? You know, I think we should not be too sanguine about that. We have to realize that the monetary system that we have today is a hybrid system in which banks issue their own money as well. That's private money, and that interfaces with public money. And the effect that different channels, or how you use private money and how you make it convertible or not, or you actually use dollar-denominated asset rather than another denomination, will have an impact also on the sovereign currency. So I think it could make a huge difference in terms of thinking what the state can do, but we're doing this in the context of a system where private money, credit money, is the dominant form of money, which is backed by state money. And if the backing structure changes, the private structure will have to change too, but we probably cannot entirely predict exactly in what sense it will change immediately, and how we can rechannel it in the longer term.
Thank you very much. I want to read this question now. It's Gabrielle Amitzis. What do you think about the conflict between economic rights of private legal persons and social rights of persons at risk? The request is for a comment about the protection of first residents of over-indebted families to private banks.
Yeah. So I think, you know, the system that has evolved and has evolved over a longer period of time has given private parties the power and the possibility to forge their rights in property rights and other things. We have relied for our social rights mostly on the state. And as others have said before, Reich has talked about the new property rights in the 1960s, so that these rights that are granted by the states are typically weaker because they're always contingent on being withdrawn again. The state gives you some social rights for some time and then doesn't have the spending power, we're coming back to that issue, and then takes it back again. Whereas the property rights that we create are protected not only property in private law, they're also protected in constitutional law, and so they get reinforced. So the big question is basically, could we also, and what we want to do this, leave it to private parties or encourage coders of the law in the more private transactional fashion to protect individuals with the law? Or could the state do it in such a way that it actually makes binding commitment, lasting commitments to help vulnerable people? It's probably the easiest strategy to think about, but that would have to be done, because I think reliance is the only constraint right now on states taking back the generosity, and it's always like it's a generosity, it's not a right. The beauty of the private coding of these wealth-creating assets is it's perceived to be a right. It's enforceable when I want to enforce it. I might not always succeed, but that's what I can do. Whereas the social rights become dependence on the generosity of a state at a particular moment in time.
Thank you. Now, I guess we have another 5 or 7 minutes. We can gather a few more questions, if this is possible. I would like to have well, one question is a very short one, and is about this high irony of self-destruction as equalizer that you were talking about. What Juliana Gak is asking, what does the self-destruction of the system mean?
Yeah. So if we all enter into contract with one another that are binding and will be rigorously enforced, that was saying you pay me $50 in 10 days plus interest, and then you also make similar commitment. Everybody makes kind of commitment. We all assume that the world in 10 days, or let's say a year, looks like the world looked today. So it's not such an unreasonable assumption unless you get something like COVID or you get a financial crisis, right? So we make these commitments, we incur these obligations. If you enforce all of these obligations when the circumstances have changed without adapting that, you will bring the system to its knees, because nobody will be able to pay, and those who can't get the money from their own debtor, they have promised to pay back their own creditors, and so the system basically collapses into itself. So our credit-based financial system, which was what it is basically vulnerable to these shocks. We knew this from banks. This is why we regulate banks. We have recreated the system as a market-based shadow banking system, we call it, but it's really market-based credit system, which has exactly the same kind of features. If you have all these fixed incomes claims against others, you will also use your right in times of crisis to enforce them, because as a private entity, if you can't get the money back from the others but have to pay your creditors, you go bankrupt. Right? We have a pretty brutal system. If you can't manage your assets and liabilities, you go bankrupt. So you will enforce. If everybody enforces at the same time, no doubt the system will self-destroy. And from that, you can come back only by saying, actually, let's stop this. You can't enforce. We do this on an individual basis in bankruptcy. That's basically what a bankruptcy procedure does. The individual creditors cannot enforce against the debtor. Time out at least. Now we sort of collect all the claims, and then you get a pro rata from whatever assets are left, right, on an individual basis. If you have a system-wide effect, using bankruptcy is not a very powerful thing because it takes too long, right? And so what the governments then do is they intervene through debt moratoria, sometimes temporarily, or they bail out banks because they're afraid that the entire banking system might fail, etc. So we get interventions to prevent. And I'm basically abstracting from exactly what they're doing and saying essentially what they're doing is that they are suspending or relaxing the contractual commitments that folks have made to one another by giving somebody the money that you don't owe to them, right? So you give the money liquidity support. If you give a bank liquidity support, it's basically because you don't want it to fail, but you don't really have a legal obligation to do so. It's a discretionary act of power.
Thank you. Rodrigo Salgado is asking, well, the beginning of the question is stating, in the beginning of the year, Professor Pistor pointed that necessity of a free money, quote unquote, embodied with a demurrage feature to avoid both inflation and the lack of circulation. Could you comment about these and say if it still is a good idea almost a year after your proposal?
Yeah, I think I wrote a little blog in March actually, and trying to revive ideas of other writers that had come earlier, who basically said, you know, the nature of the money is ultimately critical for the distribution of wealth. Communities need a means of exchange, and you can create a means of exchange. And one of the ways in which we have turned a means of exchange in a wealth creating vehicle is of course by charging interest. But if you do the opposite, if you say if you hold on to that money rather than recirculate it, the money loses value. There is some, not much, but there's some historical evidence that communities that have done that have actually seen greater levels of equality, because this power to use money itself as a source of extraction basically is taken away by forcing you to recycle the money. And if folks have something to, you know, exchange their goods, services, whatever they can do within a community, then they might actually survive also in times of economic crisis. So there are examples from Germany in the 1930s where cities issued these kind of currencies and did really well. What typically happens is that the central state comes back and say, you can't do this because we are the money issuer, you're not the money issuer, right? They tolerate private money issuers, private banks who issue credit money, but they don't tolerate other public entities to do so. And there are more sophisticated schemes out there. Robert Hockett at Cornell has developed that, and there are even legislative proposals that have been introduced to the parliaments in New York and other states and other communities in Switzerland and elsewhere using it. So it's not completely new. I think it's still a viable thing to consider if we want to revitalize communities and their economic activities. And with the digital capacity that we have today, we could actually scale it much beyond just small communities where people know each other. And that's part of the proposals that are currently being developed, I think.
Thank you. I would kindly ask, I suppose it's Raquel Ilha to mute the microphone. We have a background noise here, and I see the only one in my screen unmuted is.
It might also have been on my side because my husband was walking down the staircase. So.
Excellent. We have another couple of questions. I think we can see what we can do with these questions. I think one is related to the discussion about the hierarchy of rights in general. So Jomo is asking, in the context of the rule of law today, can one realistically expect human rights to overcome property or contractual rights or trump them?
The way we have configured the system, almost no, right? In most constitutional system, property rights is also considered to be kind of a human right, and you can make good arguments for that as well. So that's sort of one of the internal contradictions. Don't we all have to have some assets with which we can exercise our self-authorship, as Hanoch Dagan or others might put it? So there's there's within the world of human rights, there's already a tension. But more importantly, in most legal systems, the idea is that your human rights or civil political rights are rights against the state, not necessarily against other private parties. So we have this tension built into our legal systems, also in democratic constitutional systems, that private parties can configure their own rights. They're not subject to the same constraints that the state would be under. Doesn't mean that private parties can engage in human right abuse, and we can adopt legislation that constrains them to some extent. But in principle, the way these rights have been configured is that private parties have much greater leeway in using, again, they're also using the power of the state. I think that's really important to realize. This is not a market outside a state system. It is harnessing the coercive powers of the state for your own private transactions, and doing it in a way that is allowed to maximize your profit and economic interest, even at the expense of others, right? So one would have to think deeper about how to reconfigure that system and give private parties more rights to use human rights arguments, perhaps against other private parties. But that would be a big step, especially in the United States, but even in other countries as well.
Thank you. I'm aware of time. I think we can gather one more question. I am also aware of the fact that Dr. Ha-Joon Chang has limited time for us. So the last question I would like to gather is, well, now we have a new one, and I'm going to read this. Well, one question is about authoritarianism. Can we speak of an authoritarian scenario in this respect? And the other one is more technical, and it's, do you think interest rate capping is a way of inverting the pyramid? I think right now we're in such a low interest rate environment, and we see a very steep pyramid, that this is not the only issue, right? So so I think it could flatten it out, and I said this in the terms of, when we talk about demurrage functions or aspects of currencies, that interest is of course one way in which you can make money, but you can also do it by trading
your assets in a capture market and trying to make a cut on the difference. So it probably wouldn't be the only thing. In terms of suspending the law, then typically, and I'm saying this is what we observe. It's not something, of course, that I normatively would support or that I think is necessarily so, but we very often observe that actors such as central banks in particular, when they intervene in financial markets, they do this to protect the system, right? And they protect it so that they don't have to protect the entire system, but they protect the core of it. Is this authoritarian? In the sense is that the system is hierarchical and they're basically intervening at the very top. They also very often intervene far too late because they allow the stress to be built on the periphery, to build up at the core, so that they have no choice in the end, or they at least believe to have no choice, but to rescue the system at its very core. And there is something, that's certainly hierarchical to it. The question is whether you could compel central banks and others to do otherwise, right? And whether we could create mechanisms, something I've been thinking about that, those on the periphery, households, others, might be able to raise a white flag and try to trigger some remedies earlier on so the stress doesn't begin to build, so we can flatten out the crisis much earlier. But this would be, you would have to think this through and think how this fits into what we have to do to change the system to make this more feasible.
Thank you very much, Professor Pistor. It was a pleasure and an honor to learn from your lecture and from the Q&A. And it is now time for me to introduce you to our second distinguished speaker. Ha-Joon Chang is currently a reader in the political economy and development at the University of Cambridge, UK. And Professor Chang is the author of several widely discussed policy books, most notably Kicking Away the Ladder, 2002, subtitled Development Strategy in Historical Perspective. In 2013, Prospect magazine ranked Professor Chang as one of the top 20 world thinkers. And he has served as a consultant to the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the European Investment Bank, as well as to Oxfam and various United Nations agencies. He's also a fellow at the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. Sorry, there was an interference with he's a fellow at the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C., and he's also serving on the advisory board of Academics Stand Against Poverty. Professor Chang is talking today about the impact of COVID-19 on the global economic order. Thank you, Professor Chang, for being here. You are muted. You are muted. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation, and thank you everyone for attending this talk. Yeah, I didn't want to make it entirely into a lecture, and agreed with the organizers that I will present a short talk, 15, maybe 20 minutes, and use the rest of the time for questions and answers. So I want to today talk about the current global economic order and how the COVID pandemic may affect that order in the future. So to give you the context, today we have a global economic order based on this neoliberal views on the economy, the legal system. Professor Pistor has talked about that, and social arrangements. Now, one important thing about this order is that it is insisting on applying one rule for everyone. In the name of level playing field, it is saying that, for example, if you are a member of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, you basically have to follow the same rule. I mean, there are minor exceptions for the poorest countries known as the least developed countries, but that's about it. Now, while that is the theory, in practice, the rules are applied in such a way that the rich countries can get away with breaking rules. You know, especially the US has been ruled against that in the dispute settlement panel in the WTO, which the structurally is biased towards the rich countries, but it doesn't just follow the ruling. You know, it just does its own thing, and you know, I mean, it's a complicated story, but that basically doesn't stick to them. Even then, that President Trump was very upset that these multilateral organizations restrict the freedom of the US and have disengaged formally and informally from many of them. So that is a great injustice to this global economic order. Of course, you know, to put it in really longer term perspective, it's still better than the old days at you know, the 19th century, early 20th century, when most of the weaker nations were either colonies or subject to the so-called unequal treaties, in which they were deprived of their right to set tariffs. They had to concede so-called extraterritoriality, meaning that if the a citizen of the stronger countries commit crime in a weaker country, the weaker country cannot try that person. He or she has to be sent back home because it was declared that the standard of the legal system in the weaker countries are not up to scratch. There were a lot of consensus on the mining and other rights to exploit natural resources, territorial concessions, like the way Hong Kong was leased to Britain after the Opium War in the Nanjing Treaty. Yeah, so compared to those days, the current global economic order at least has the pretense of being even-handed and so on. But the problem is that I mean, never mind the kind of the practice that not even nearly that kind of living up to the formal arrangement, but that formal arrangement that requires that everyone follows the same rule is itself very unjust for developing countries. You know, it is put in terms of the level playing field, and that idea I think we need to fight, because you know, level playing field is fair only when the two teams are, I mean, similarly matched. Yeah. So yeah, in the World Cup, if the I don't know, the Brazilian national team attacks from up the hill and the Argentinian national team has to attack from down the hill, it is very unfair. You need level playing field, but I would say that the tilted playing field is a fair one when one team is the Brazilian national team and the other team is made up of 12-year-old girls. Yeah? So this the idea of having the same rule makes sense only when you have equal players. I mean, you might think I'm giving extreme example, but you know, in all kinds of sports there are structural barriers against the unequal players playing against each other. You know, there are age classes, gender division, in many sports like boxing, wrestling, weightlifting, taekwondo, judo. You have the weight classes. And for example, in the lighter classes of the boxing, like featherweight, flyweight, the weight band is between 1.5 and 2 kilos. So in boxing, you think that someone who's 2 kilos heavier than someone else, beating up the light guy is so unfair that you make it structurally impossible for these people to compete against each other. And in international trade, you think that Honduras of course should play by the same rule as Switzerland, you know, or the Guinea-Bissau has to achieve the same kind of the standard of, I don't know, intellectual property right protection as the United States and so on. So there are a lot of the big structural problems with the global economic order. But I think this corona pandemic is going to, especially in the longer run, have some significant impact on the current global economic order, basically because it's going to change the balance of power between the rich countries and the developing countries. And it's not simply because, you know, in economic terms, developing countries especially those in Asia and Africa, have suffered less from this pandemic and the consequent economic crisis than the rich countries, which means that their relative weight is going to increase, and that will give them more the influence in the construction, reform, and management of the global economic order. That is pretty straightforward, but there are other more subtle effects that I think will influence the way that in which the global economic order is going to operate in the future. Now, at the very sort of material level, I think that there will be some reorganization of global production as a result of this pandemic. Now, some people have talked about massive reshoring of manufacturing back to the rich nations. So now that we know relying too much on import is risky, especially if it comes from the potentially hostile nation like China. We are going to bring back production. There was a lot of talk of that in the beginning, but I think that for many countries it's a fantasy. You know, for countries like the US, the UK, France, deindustrialization, that is declining of manufacturing sector, has progressed so far. It has basically destroyed the ecosystem that you need in order to have a viable industry. So if the US wants to bring back the production of iPhone to the United States, it cannot just bring back the factory that assembles iPhone. I mean, it needs to bring back a whole host of supplier firms. It needs to create the necessary a new workforce that has the necessary skill. It has to create all kinds of supporting businesses ranging from logistics to business services. Yeah, I mean, technically that can be done, but it will be extremely costly to do that. So I don't think that kind of reshoring is going to happen much. However, there might be some attempt to diversify supplier sources so that these global supply chains become more resilient to shocks. But how that is going to unfold in which industry, into which countries, is not clear yet. It's something to watch, but it's difficult to predict. I mean, a lot of companies have, since the breakout of the pandemic, have talked about so-called China +1 policy. So, for example, instead of supplying everything from China, you build another supplier base in Vietnam and so on. Yeah, for some things, this may be relatively easy to do and not too costly, but there are the reasons why so many factories are in China. So yeah, I mean, outwardly, Cambodia may have a wage level that is, I don't know exactly, but that 1/3, 1/4 of the Chinese level, probably even less. But firms don't go to Cambodia except to produce some very basic, very labor-intensive things, because there are problems with quality control. There are the shortages of skilled workers, the lack of infrastructure, and so on. So even this diversification is not going to be that easy. However, some of that will happen, and this might slightly change the geography of global production. But the more important are at the level of ideas. More important that changes are going to be at the level of ideas. First of all, a lot of developing countries have not only been bound by this the unfair global rules, but have also been kind of locked into this ideological cage. So part of it was that basically external pressure, the World Bank, the IMF, demanding that these countries use particular types of basically pro-market policies, and that basically people who argue against those policies being marginalized, because when you advocate these kind of policies, there's no kind of money coming with it to make those policies feasible. But if you advocate the World Bank, the IMF style policies, you will get money. So naturally over time, the developed countries have increasingly become kind of convinced that these neoliberal policies are the only policies that are kind of not only feasible, but also beneficial. And yeah, I mean, the international investors behave in a certain way, international lenders behave in a certain way that basically pushes these countries to use the neoliberal policies, which are particularly bad for developing countries. I mean, these policies have been bad for even the rich countries, as we all know. I mean, the lower growth, the greater inequality, more political discontent, and so on. But these policies are particularly bad for developing countries. But they've been using this now with this the pandemic. The legitimacy of these neoliberal policies, which had been already shaken a bit, less than what it should have been, but shaken somewhat as a result of the 2008 global financial crisis. But this time, every policy orthodoxy has been thrown out of the window because of pandemic management. And when you see the US government sending checks to supplement the incomes of low income and or unemployed people, when you see the UK government subsidizing 80% of the wages through the so-called furlough scheme, where the firms were encouraged to keep staff on the payroll, and on the kind of condition that the government that pays 80% of their wages. When you see the German government scrapping the ceiling on the public debt and so on, you know that none of these policies that had been presented as something absolutely sacred, or actually no such things. So no doubt that when the pandemic's over, especially if it is brought under control soon, I mean, there'll be a huge kind of rollback, you know, like what happened after the 2008 financial crisis. But at least that one more time, the legitimacy of these neoliberal ideas have been shaken, and a lot of developing countries are realizing, well, that maybe these were not such sacred policies, and that will make them more aggressive in demanding reform of the global economic order. And yeah, that kind of basically talking back to the rich countries, saying, look, you guys have broke all these rules that were supposed to be sacred by the neoliberal orthodoxy. Why can't we break it? Yeah. Also, I think that this crisis has had a very unexpected effect of weakening the inferiority complex that developing country people have vis-a-vis the rich nations. In the pandemic, we have seen that countries like the US, the UK, France, especially, which had huge imperialist kind of legacies, telling other people that they are the models of liberal democracy, paragons of kind of high quality institutions, repositories of highest human culture. These countries have been exposed as being incompetent, and more importantly, totally callous in terms of the respect of human life and human rights. I just don't see how that these people can now talk about human rights and things like that when they have killed tens of thousands of people who could have been saved. In contrast, that many developing countries, Vietnam, Rwanda, very poor countries, the Mozambique, Tanzania, I mean, they have managed this the pandemic very well. And I think now people are beginning to see that, look, that actually is not always the case that what the developed countries, the rich countries do is that better, they are superior to us. Now that they have seen that the emperor has no clothes, I think that this is going to change a lot of people's mind, and in the longer run, their approach to dealing with these the rich nations, these rich nations. I mean, there are some rich nations that have managed this quite well, but these are mostly kind of smaller countries with no imperialist history, or in case of countries like South Korea and Finland, themselves the victims of the colonization. So, you know, most of the countries that dominated the others, presented themselves as the models of humanity, they will have very diminished moral authority when they try to lecture other countries in terms of the conduct of their the economic policy and the political system. So I think that we are, I mean, still in the middle of this pandemic, and therefore it's difficult to predict how these things are going to play out. But I think there are distinct possibilities that this pandemic might be a turning point in how the global economic order is going to be reformed and managed. Okay, let me stop there. I have spoken a little more than I had planned, but I hope there's sufficient time for some good discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chang. There is time for discussion and Q&A. I actually have 2 questions for you, and I will move into the questions without any further comments on my part. I do have some, but I don't want to take advantage of this. We have a question from Milena Ponchio, and she asks, the question now disappeared from my screen. I don't know why. There was
It's gone.
Okay, the question disappeared, but Amanda Salgado has a question. Do you think that the coronavirus economic crisis reclaim another movement to the underdeveloped countries to centralize the national states in the same role against the structural phenomenon that you circle kick the ladder?
All right. Huh.
To centralize the national states in the same role.
I'm not entirely sure that I understand this.
The question. I suppose the question is asking whether these crises requires a movement from these developing countries to reclaim or to re-centralize their national economies.
Oh, right. Yeah,
I suppose.
Yeah, it's probably, yeah. Okay, yeah, no, I think that this crisis at the national level has actually highlighted the need to create a more kind of egalitarian society. You know, in the crisis, we have clearly seen that, you know, in a situation like this, no one is safe unless everyone is safe. You know, because we know that in the countries with inadequate welfare system, I mean, this includes rich nations like the US, but of course the problem is far more serious in the developing nations, countries with inadequate welfare state, kind of the poor protection of the workers in terms of not giving workers the sick pay and the kind of other kind of cushions you know, in those countries that a lot of people had to work even if they were sick and went out. And in developing countries, many of those people had to be on the street to make the money to feed their family. And as a result, they became the spreaders of this disease. So, you know, that we have realized that we need to provide unemployed unemployment insurance, universal health care, the sick pay, and other protection for the workers and vulnerable people if we are going to control this kind of situation. So I think in a lot of societies that there's move towards greater solidarity. So the build up the welfare state, the give protection to self-employed people who even in some rich countries are kind of not really covered very well by the welfare state. So I think at the national level, there's certainly there's a recognition of the need to unify the provision, provide access to essential goods and services, including healthcare to everyone. So I think I mean, in that way, this crisis has, had some positive effect, I think.
I understand. Yeah. We do have a question from Thomas Pogge. I suppose, Thomas, you could.
Yeah, I can ask it myself. I should apologize. It was me who disposed of Milena's question because I can't type questions into the Q&A because I'm one of the speakers. So I tried to type an answer to her, but that made both my answer and her question disappear. Anyway, so her question was, will the vaccine race for COVID-19 be another way to kick the ladder for underdeveloped countries?
Yeah, well, certainly. This is a very important issue because if we are to follow this WTO rule on the intellectual property rights, basically poor countries will have to pay very, very high price to these vaccines which will have patents owned by these the pharmaceutical companies in the rich countries. So this issue of intellectual property rights has been a huge issue, even before the pandemic. In the early 2000s, there's a huge controversy because the 42 multinational pharmaceutical companies decided to take the South African government to the country's constitutional court and argue that the South African governments attempt to procure HIV/AIDS drugs from countries which at that time didn't fully protect the patents in the way demanded by the WTO, like Thailand and Brazil and so on, was against the South African Constitution, which gives freedom of business. So there's a huge controversy, because South African government and other developing country government argue that, if we want to keep on HIV/AIDS the patient healthy for a year with patented drugs, it costs in those days money between $12,000 and $15,000. We can do that with $300 to $500 if we bought these drugs up from basically the non-patented sources. And yeah, that's such a was such an outrageous contrast that the pharmaceutical companies that lost the war of public opinion and had to, give these countries that 80% discount and so on. But even so, it was still 80% of the $12,000 is 20% of $20,000 is still $1,000, not $300, $500. So yeah, so this pandemic is going to bring that issue back to the table. Do we really say that people should die if they don't have money? So I think this will be a test of our commitment to basic human rights I think that already the drug companies are kind of making noises saying, we are not going to profit hugely from this and so on. But, you know, even if the drug companies themselves do not behave as aggressively as they did that in relation to HIV/AIDS drugs, you know, the national governments of rich countries might be kind of aggressive in preventing the sale of these vaccines to other countries. So yeah, I mean, I think this will be a very good test of how, you know, our kind of lip service to common human fate and basic human rights, how serious those lip services are.
Yeah, so my own question really connects with that. And you said that COVID-19 is going to effect a shift in power from the richer countries to the poorer countries. And that shift in power, of course, holds forth the promise of maybe changing the global economic order to make it a little bit less unjust and burdensome to the poor. But it seems that there are three conditions for that to happen. One is that the governments of the poorer countries have to really have the needs and interests of their populations at heart, rather than be easily bought off.
Yeah.
Secondly, they have to collaborate, or at least the more they collaborate, the more they work together, the more power they can exert in international fora on rule making and rule design. And then thirdly, they also have to agree on an agenda. There are many ways in which the global order is unjust and burdensome. And if you fight all these battles at the same time, you are going to lose most of them. So it would be good to concentrate your forces on one or two things where the poor countries say, these are things that we absolutely want now. For example, intellectual property rights. But what I wanted to hear from you is something about the prospects of this sort of united front with a common agenda, and what you think should be the key issues that the South should raise.
Yes. Yeah, no, of course, that cooperation among the weak is the main source of power for the weaker people. You know, we've seen it in trade union movement and all kinds of other social movements. So cooperation is vital between developing nations, but of course it's easier said than done. I mean, partly because the developing countries, they are not the same, you know. I mean, that the income gap between, say, the US and Mexico is actually a lot smaller than the gap between Mexico and, say, the Burundi, you know. So in the big category called developing countries, you have all sorts of different countries wanting different things, needing different things. So that's one difficulty about forging a united front. But also the rich countries, you know, is always been the strategy of the strong, you know, the so-called divide and rule. You know? So, for example, when the WTO ruled that this the Lome Convention that gave the special access to the European Union, special access to the European Union market to the so-called ACP countries, Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific. Basically, most of them were former colonies of European nations. I mean, the WTO that rule that is a preferential treatment that is not consistent with the WTO rules. What the EU did was not to negotiate it with all the ACP countries, about 90 countries together. It the EU then said, yeah, we are going to replace it with another arrangement called the Economic Partnership Agreement, which is consistent with the WTO rules. But the interesting thing is that the EU didn't negotiate with all the ACP countries together this time. Yeah? It divided up these countries into like 7 different groups. Yeah? So East African group, Central African group, the Caribbean group. Yeah, suddenly, I mean, quite a powerful bloc of 90 nations was reduced to 9 countries here, 11 countries there. They were much weaker. Eh? So this divide and rule that goes on, making the United Front more difficult. So I think that I'm not a politician or an organizer of social movement, but these barriers need to be overcome. But yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you, Thomas, in saying that that focusing on a small number of key issues is important, because as it is that developing countries have much poorer negotiation resources. So they really need to concentrate on a small number of things. They're gonna fight too many battles all at the same time. And yeah, I think that in this particular conjuncture, I mean, focusing on intellectual property rights, this idea of people's vaccine, however you may call it, is providing the focal point, but that we should use this pandemic and the need for affordable vaccines, use these to have a broader debate on intellectual property rights. Because I mean, even in the rich countries, intellectual property rights are becoming actually obstacles rather than spurs to innovation and economic development. There's a lot of evidence for that, but especially when it comes to developing countries, it's a totally one-sided game. I mean, in trade, in international trade in the goods, even the poorest countries have something to sell. I mean, okay, it's going to be something very cheap and very vulnerable to the price fluctuations, and vulnerable to the other countries that are developing synthetic substitute. But at least they'll have their, I don't know, bananas or the tobaccos or coffees to sell. But when it comes to intellectual property, the ownership is completely skewed. The rich countries own 97% of world patents, and most developing countries really have like essentially zero tariff patents, so they always buy. So this has to be taken into account, and the arrangement needs to be very different from the trade in the goods and services, especially goods. I mean, I'm not saying that the arrangement for international trade in goods is fair, but it's so much more unfair in the case of intellectual property, and therefore I think that this is a very good chance to rekindle the debate on intellectual property rights in general, through which we can have an even broader debate on the justice of global economic order.
Thank you, Professor Chang. I have another question. I'm aware of time. I would say another maybe 5 minutes if it's possible.
Yeah, sure.
You do have another.
Yeah, no, I need to leave at 4, maybe 1 or 2 minutes after 4. So, well, 4, that is my time.
Another
so,
7-8 minutes.
Yeah, probably 7-8 minutes, yeah.
Excellent. So I have a question from Bruno Bastos de Oliveira, who congratulates for the lecture and asks, does the development project of countries like Brazil within an interconnected global order have a way of practically opposing the economic policies induced by developed countries? So this is specific about Brazil.
Yeah, Brazil has gone through many different models. So there was the old style so-called import substitution model, starting with Getulio Vargas in the 1930s and lasting until the 1970s. And then there was a period of the kind of turmoil where it wasn't clear what the model was for about 10 years due to the debt crisis. And then Fernando Henrique Cardoso came in with a more neoliberal model. Of course, Lula and Dilma kind of moved it somewhat to the left, but the essential development model was the same, except that you had I mean, this is not trivial, but without touching the fundamental structure, you had those two presidents of the Workers' Party had introduced Bolsa Familia and other redistributive measures. But then now that we have a regime, but President Bolsonaro, which is more or less trying to go back to the 1920s. Yeah? So, totally natural resource dependent. So, I mean, which Brazilian model are we talking about? I mean, of course, that people have different assessment of these different models. But I think that insofar as Brazil can be kind of proud of its achievement of the past, it is the regime the old regime that made Brazil a powerful manufacturing nation, producing companies like Embraer and Petrobras and some world-class companies. Since then, I mean, I'm sorry to say, but that even during the Workers' Party's rule, I mean, the share of manufacturing kept declining. Now it's barely 10% of GDP. I mean, at one point in the 80s, it was nearly 30%. And yeah, I mean, Brazil's dependence on natural resources like iron ore, soya beans, and so on have actually risen, not fallen, during the recent period. So I don't know. I mean, at least that you need to arrest Brazil going back to the 1920s through the current Bolsonaro model. But beyond that, what do you want? What can you do? I mean, I'm not saying that you should or can go back to the 1960s, but it certainly needs a model that is more based on innovation and productivity growth. But unfortunately, everything's been going in the opposite direction in the last 3 decades, quarter century. So, I mean, Brazil has a lot of very distinguished economies, so I don't need to tell them what to do. But yeah, I mean, the countries are at a serious juncture because, really, I mean, I think that if this kind of regime continues for another, couple of terms, then yeah, Brazil's going to go back to the 1920s. The only new thing would be the financial sector. Other than that, it will be like the 1920s.
Thank you, Professor Chang. I have 2 questions now, moving from Brazil to China. And I have two questions about China. I think the question can be put in these terms. One of the questions is from Philippe Moutio, which asks, can you please say something about the debate in various circles that the reason why nations are moving their manufacturing base from China is because of how China handled the pandemic? And perhaps, and the addition to this is a comment, perhaps China, as a very powerful nation, could have mitigated the situation much better. The other question is related from Jamel Eddin Loisiet, sorry for the pronunciation. And the question is basically following up on this. In case many countries decide to onshore the industries, they can bring back to their own frontiers, within their own frontiers. How do you see China reacting and restructuring its export-oriented economy?
Yeah, China was the initial source of this pandemic, but it has managed it quite efficiently. Some people, as a result, has drawn this conclusion that you need the authoritarianism to control this kind of pandemic, but this is completely wrong. Eh? I mean, look at Finland, look at South Korea, look at New Zealand, look at Denmark. Eh? I mean, you can manage this very effectively in democracy with strong human rights and so on. So please let the Chinese example not to be misused as an argument used by people who failed in pandemic management as an excuse to say that, well, I mean, if you wanted us to manage pandemic, that you should have accepted the authoritarianism, and since you don't want that, this is the best we can do. No, that is not true. Yeah? So let's get that out of the way. But yeah, I mean, there will be some restructuring of global value chains, as I mentioned earlier, but I don't think it's going to be that significant. I mean, especially for the reason that even if you want to move some of these things out of China, it's actually not that easy. Because China is a very efficient producer of lots of things. And I mean, trying to move it to, I don't know, Cambodia or Laos or Ethiopia, I mean, it's not easy. Also, this threat of so-called reshoring, China might have been frightened of it if this happened, say, 15 years ago, but not anymore. China, I mean, of course, it's still a relatively underdeveloped nation. Its per capita income is only about $10,000. 1/6 of the level in North America and Europe, but it now has its own ability to generate new technologies and develop new industries. So even if Americans say, "Oh, we are going to take iPhone back to California," the Chinese will say, "Okay, be my guest. We'll produce our own phones," which they do already. Xiaomi and all these companies are, maybe not as advanced as the iPhone, but in terms of value for money, they are as good as anyone. So I'm afraid that this reshoring is not going to be a threat to China, except in a few, the selected industries. But then I said, I mean, yeah, maybe Germany, maybe South Korea, maybe Switzerland, they can reshore because they still have very strong manufacturing sector. But when it comes to the US, the UK, France, forget about it. They have already destroyed their manufacturing base, and it'll be very time consuming and expensive, not impossible, but time-consuming and impossible to rebuild it. And I think I need to go.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I cannot stay for longer.
It was a pleasure and an honor.
Thank you very much.
Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
And now we have, last but not least, Gilberto Bercovici. Professor Bercovici holds a PhD in state law from the University of Sao Paulo, Brazil. He was visiting professor at the University of Lecce in Italy and is part of the research staff of the Center for the Study of Contemporary Culture, CEDEC. He's currently a full professor at the Department of Economic, Budgetary and Tax Law at DEF, University of Sao Paulo, and in the Postgraduate Program in Political and Economic Law at Mackenzie Presbyterian University. Professor Bercovici is lecturing about COVID-19, economic law, and the industrial health complex. Thank you, Professor.
Bom dia a todos e a todas. Eu queria agradecer o convite para poder estar aqui hoje. E, sem mais delongas, já inicio a minha fala. A atual pandemia da Covid-19 e as crises sanitária e econômica dela decorrentes trouxeram à baila novamente as discussões sobre o direito em tempos de crise. No caso específico do direito econômico, a crise faz parte da sua própria essência, tendo em vista que é um campo que surge e se consolida em virtude das grandes crises e transformações econômicas e sociais da primeira metade do século XX. Crises e transformações essas vinculadas às forças da industrialização e da urbanização que se ampliaram a partir da segunda metade do século XIX e aos conflitos sociais, políticos e econômicos gerados nesse processo. Já ao final do século XIX, além das polêmicas em torno das relações entre direito e economia, pode-se afirmar que começou a se estruturar, com as transformações advindas da Revolução Industrial, uma espécie de direito econômico antes do tempo, na expressão de Mihail Stolais, muito marcado pela crise e mudanças do direito privado tradicional e focado em torno da empresa. A formação da sociedade industrial acarretou o enfraquecimento do liberalismo, embora o discurso liberal permanecesse hegemônico. A ampliação da população urbana gerou uma maior demanda por serviços públicos e por infraestruturas essenciais, como transporte urbano, energia, saneamento, além da necessidade de investimentos maciços em ferrovias, portos, usinas, estradas, etc. O processo de industrialização também gerou grandes conglomerados, a expansão dos bancos, das sociedades anônimas, das seguradoras, dos contratos de massa, entre outras modificações nos tradicionais institutos do direito privado. A codificação do direito privado havia deixado de fora uma série de campos vinculados às relações econômicas. As precárias condições de trabalho, especialmente nas fábricas, também vão ser contestadas pelos movimentos dos trabalhadores, e de suas lutas vão surgir as primeiras leis trabalhistas e de seguridade social, além do início da ampliação do direito de voto, que culmina na adoção do sufrágio universal masculino e feminino após a Primeira Guerra Mundial, em países como a Inglaterra e a Alemanha. Com a Primeira Guerra Mundial, os estados envolvidos são obrigados a se reestruturar. Como primeira guerra total da história, a Primeira Guerra Mundial exige uma mobilização nunca antes vista de todas as forças econômicas e sociais dos países envolvidos para o esforço bélico. A luta contra a economia do inimigo envolveu a disputa por matérias-primas, tecnologia e inovação, novas formas de logística e de planejamento, se fizeram necessárias, inclusive com a criação de corporações estatais específicas para a guerra, que organizaram a indústria e a agricultura. Era a organização do que se convencionou chamar de economia de guerra. É desse período o livro de um autor alemão, Richard Kahn, chamado Conceitos Jurídicos de Direito Econômico de Guerra, em que ele trata do direito econômico como um direito da guerra. Para Kahn, o direito econômico é um direito excepcional, voltado para a organização da economia de guerra. Há uma ênfase na centralização econômica e no planejamento. Kahn, como outros autores, como Ernst Heimann e outros, são todos provenientes do direito privado e entendem as mudanças que estão ocorrendo em vários setores do direito privado, a preponderância cada vez maior do direito público, como algo provisório, algo acarretado pelo momento excepcional da guerra. Eles acham que o direito econômico seria algo que simplesmente passaria após o fim do conflito. Mas não foi o que ocorreu. A partir da Primeira Guerra Mundial, a política econômica ganha evidência, assim como a política social. O arcabouço jurídico vai ter que lidar com as transformações profundas geradas pela industrialização e pela guerra, organizando juridicamente o espaço de acumulação de capital, ou seja, o processo econômico. Esse seria o novo direito econômico. Não por acaso, em 1919, o grande industrial alemão Walter Rathenau afirmava: a economia é nosso destino, e a economia não é mais um assunto privado, mas sim um problema de toda a coletividade. Desde o período imediatamente posterior à guerra, há, portanto, um debate doutrinário imenso em torno das concepções de direito econômico. A própria utilização da expressão direito econômico se consolida após a guerra, com seu emprego pelo privatista Justus Wilhelm Hedemann para designar uma nova disciplina jurídica. Não seria mais uma disciplina transitória ou excepcional, como um direito de guerra. Não era também uma disciplina limitada à organização industrial. Tratava-se de uma nova concepção do papel do Estado e do direito em relação à economia, entendendo-se a dimensão econômica como elemento de especificidade do direito contemporâneo. Vinculado, portanto, à reestruturação do capitalismo que tem lugar no sistema mundial no início do século XX, o direito econômico se desenvolve como uma disciplina estreitamente ligada à razão macroeconômica dos processos nacionais de desenvolvimento. Não é por acaso que a perspectiva macrojurídica vai ser firmada como essência do direito econômico, destacando a economia dos agregados como a base do processo de regulação da política econômica do Estado. Em geral, as várias concepções de direito econômico irão se reportar à ordenação do processo econômico ou à organização da política econômica estatal. Mas qualquer que seja a perspectiva adotada, e há dezenas delas, um elemento é comum a toda e qualquer definição de direito econômico: a ideia de organização jurídica do espaço político-econômico da acumulação. Não por acaso, ainda em 1923, Hans Goldschmidt definiu o direito econômico como o direito da economia organizada. Na presente crise, o papel de organização do processo econômico, do direito econômico, é, evidentemente, fundamental. Essa importância não se deve, no entanto, à situação que muitos equiparam equivocadamente à chamada economia de guerra. A economia de guerra exige a mobilização total dos fatores de produção para o esforço de derrotar o inimigo. Paradoxalmente, como já perceberam alguns autores, como James Midway e Adam Tooze, a atual crise sanitária exige justamente a desmobilização de setores da economia, como segmentos de prestação de serviços, enquanto outros, como o setor industrial, por exemplo, devem ser não só mobilizados, como até ampliados. Tornou-se imprescindível ter que garantir a renda das pessoas, independentemente de estarem empregadas ou não. É imprescindível o abastecimento de produtos básicos e o funcionamento contínuo de serviços essenciais, exigindo a suspensão da lógica mercantil que vem dominando as relações econômicas e sociais nas últimas décadas. A mobilização dos poderes públicos trata, na atual conjuntura, da necessidade de uma desmobilização massiva, racional e planejada. O planejamento e a estruturação do processo econômico exigem uma atuação mais presente e mais intensa do Estado por meio do direito econômico. Em relação ao papel do Estado na economia, a Constituição brasileira de 1988 se distingue em relação às constituições brasileiras anteriores ao determinar que a competência para atuar diretamente no domínio econômico não é exclusiva da União, mas foi ampliada para os Estados-membros e os municípios, ao contrário das constituições anteriores. A atuação direta do Estado, seja por relevante interesse coletivo, seja na prestação de serviços públicos, segundo a Constituição de 88, ela é passível de ser realizada ou prestada por qualquer ente da federação. Não se limita exclusivamente à esfera federal de atuação. Há um aumento aí da participação federativa na atuação do Estado na esfera econômica. Mas não só nisso. A Constituição de 88 também incluiu a legislação sobre saúde entre as competências a serem repartidas entre a União e os demais membros da federação. E destaca, inclusive, a saúde como uma competência comum, ou seja, a competência é que todos os entes da federação devem atuar no sentido da sua realização. É a ideia da cooperação federativa na realização de programas comuns em determinados setores, particularmente no caso que interessa para nós aqui, o da saúde. A estruturação, inclusive, de um sistema único de saúde, composto por uma rede regionalizada e hierarquizada, que tem por objetivo a garantia do acesso universal à saúde, é também uma outra inovação da Constituição de 1988, fruto da luta e da mobilização de vários movimentos de defesa da saúde. Todos os serviços e ações de saúde são constitucionalmente definidos como serviços de relevância pública, lá no artigo 197 da Constituição. A importância da saúde na construção da sociedade nacional sempre foi destacada pelos grandes teóricos desenvolvimentistas. O ponto central da discussão sobre as relações entre saúde e desenvolvimento encontra-se na contraposição entre os que entendem ser a saúde, ou melhor, a falta de saúde, um obstáculo ou causa do processo de desenvolvimento, e os que entendem ser a saúde ou falta de saúde uma consequência do processo de desenvolvimento econômico e social. De qualquer modo, a garantia de melhores condições de saúde para a população é um elemento central do discurso desenvolvimentista, buscando compreender as relações entre pobreza e doença e como promover a transformação socioeconômica efetiva do país. Nesse sentido, tanto a Constituição de 88, seu artigo 196, assim como a Lei Orgânica da Saúde, são expressas em determinarem que o Estado brasileiro deve promover políticas econômicas e sociais para ampliar a garantia e o acesso à saúde a todos os cidadãos. Uma das principais políticas econômicas que dizem respeito à saúde é a política industrial da saúde. As razões para a defesa de uma política industrial são várias. Geralmente há motivos estratégicos, como manutenção de nível de emprego, proteção de setores da economia, ampliação de competitividade, né? Mas o que deve ser chamado a atenção é o fato de que, se na política industrial clássica o que se destacavam eram chamadas indústrias pesadas, como a siderurgia, a indústria de bens de consumo durável, na atualidade, os setores chamados estratégicos dizem respeito a eletrônicos, comunicações e biotecnologia, o que inclui o chamado complexo industrial da saúde. A indústria é vista como um instrumento para atingir objetivos maiores, como, por exemplo, garantir um melhor acesso à saúde. O Sistema Nacional de Saúde, portanto, também pode gerar benefícios para a economia como um todo, especialmente em termos de pesquisa e desenvolvimento tecnológico, possibilitando ainda a geração de produtos ou serviços exportáveis. Não por acaso, também a própria Constituição, no seu artigo 200, inciso 5, determina ser também competência do sistema de saúde propiciar o desenvolvimento científico e tecnológico. É nesse contexto que se deve falar em um sistema sofisticado, em que fornecedores, hospitais, seguradores e fabricantes estão interconectados, o chamado complexo industrial da saúde. Uma das suas características é que ele tem múltiplos objetivos. O principal deles, obviamente, é produzir um nível de saúde aceitável para a maior parte da população. Mas ele também gera conhecimento científico, inovação tecnológica, aumenta a capacidade produtiva da força de trabalho, entre vários outros objetivos concretos. A estruturação de um complexo industrial da saúde parte do pressuposto de que uma demanda cada vez maior por bens e serviços de saúde significa uma oportunidade não apenas para a ampliação do acesso à saúde, mas também para o desenvolvimento do país. Essas políticas variam de financiamento e melhoria das políticas públicas de saúde à criação de incentivos para encorajar mais inovações e a entrada de mais agentes no sistema industrial de saúde. O mercado interno é beneficiado, assim como a possibilidade de estruturação de um setor industrial exportador avançado e competitivo, além dos efeitos de geração de emprego, de maior capacitação científica e tecnológica da mão de obra do país. O complexo industrial da saúde é uma parte essencial do Sistema Nacional de Inovação. Boa parte das indústrias de saúde tem uma ligação com os núcleos de pesquisa científica. Os investimentos públicos ou privados em pesquisa geram efeitos positivos e inovações nos mais variados setores, né? E, inclusive, isso pode facilitar a inserção de determinados produtores no mercado internacional. No Brasil, o Complexo Industrial da Saúde é reconhecido por um decreto da Presidência da República, um decreto de 12 de maio de 2008, que criou um grupo executivo do Complexo Industrial da Saúde. E a principal preocupação desse grupo executivo é o desenvolvimento de normas e atos jurídicos necessários para a concretização das estratégias e diretrizes da política industrial, da política de desenvolvimento científico e tecnológico e das políticas de saúde que visem o desenvolvimento do complexo industrial da saúde. Mas há um problema. Essa política de desenvolvimento industrial da saúde no Brasil, ela institucionalmente é muito frágil. A base normativa dessa política é um decreto do presidente da República e não é uma lei. Ou seja, pode ser modificada a qualquer tempo basta para isso a vontade do ocupante da chefia do executivo. E a situação no Brasil se torna ainda mais precária com a atual calamidade pública sanitária, proclamada em março de 2020, né, e que mostra as limitações da nossa legislação e das nossas instituições para lidarem com a pandemia. E para mostrar essas limitações, eu vou fazer uma comparação breve com os Estados Unidos. Nos Estados Unidos, né, assim que foi decretada emergência nacional em virtude da pandemia da Covid-19, em março de 2020, o presidente da República utilizou, né, decretou a utilização dos poderes previstos no Defense Production Act de 1950. O que é o Defense Production Act de 1950? É uma lei americana que confere ao presidente da República ou às autoridades a quem ele delegar expressamente uma série de poderes e competências para reestruturar e mobilizar a economia, dirigir e incentivar as indústrias norte-americanas no interesse da defesa nacional. Essa definição de defesa nacional, que é da versão original de 1950, ela foi sendo ampliada e revista e hoje inclui também atividades preparatórias para responder a um desastre ou calamidade e a proteção e restauração da infraestrutura crítica, que inclui os sistemas de saúde pública e segurança. Dentre os poderes do presidente, destaca-se o de dar preferência ou prioridade à produção de determinado bem destinado à promoção da defesa nacional em relação a outros bens ou produtos. Ou seja, trata-se de um poder de dirigir o processo industrial em casos de interesse da defesa nacional, nesse conceito alargado. O presidente tem o poder de controlar a distribuição de materiais e serviços ao estabelecer prioridades no processo industrial, determinando a distribuição de insumos entre os diversos setores produtivos. Ele pode ainda requisitar ao industrial que produza bens e serviços que não fornece ordinariamente. A exigência legal é a de que aquele que aceita o contrato governamental seja capaz de cumpri-lo. Por isso é possível a solicitação do que se chama reconversão industrial, ou seja, a determinação de que aquela planta industrial passe a fabricar outros produtos que não necessariamente os que ela produzia antes da requisição. A lei, a Defense Production Act, permite ainda que o presidente providencie incentivos financeiros para o desenvolvimento e a expansão da capacidade de produção essencial para a defesa nacional. Os órgãos públicos, quando autorizados, podem comprar ou se comprometer com a compra de bens e serviços, fazer pagamentos subsidiados, emprestar diretamente ou oferecer garantias para financiamentos e empréstimos, e instalar ou comprar equipamentos para instalações industriais, governamentais ou privadas, visando a expansão da capacidade produtiva. Esses incentivos têm por objetivo a ampliação da capacidade doméstica da produção de bens essenciais necessários. Além também existe no Defense Production Act uma série de dispositivos que tratam de política de crédito para os setores estratégicos para a mobilização industrial. Há ainda a possibilidade prevista na lei de que o presidente pode consultar os representantes da indústria e outros interessados, visando acordos voluntários e planos de ação coordenados para ampliação da produção, colaborando na produção de materiais escassos ou criticamente necessários. Alguns autores, inclusive, acham que o essencial da aplicação do Defense Production Act é a preservação de contratos ou a manutenção do sistema de concorrência empresarial como melhor garantia para a defesa nacional, valorizando esses mecanismos de cooperação entre Estado e indústria. Em suma, a legislação americana, particularmente o Defense Production Act, permite que a mobilização industrial em nome da defesa nacional estruture novas cadeias de suprimento para matérias-primas, bens e serviços essenciais para a produção. A possibilidade de estabelecimento de sistema de prioridades para a destinação ou produção desses bens, criação de fundos, distribuição que estimula a produção nacional, a busca de materiais alternativos, a implementação de novos processos produtivos, além de uma série de medidas de proteção também às pequenas e médias empresas, para que elas possam participar da mobilização industrial, e também, se necessário, após uma deliberação do Congresso, pode haver até controle de preços e salários, com o objetivo de proteger os trabalhadores e os consumidores do aumento do custo de vida e da especulação. Ou seja, estamos diante aqui de um instrumento poderosíssimo de planejamento que permite que se possa lidar com as crises de uma maneira estratégica e organizada. O Estado americano tem um papel essencial no combate à crise e na tentativa de organizar a economia para o enfrentamento de todas as consequências da crise, inclusive a pandemia. No Brasil, várias dessas medidas que estavam presentes no Defense Production Act, podem ser entendidas como medidas de proteção da economia popular, um dos fundamentos da nossa legislação de defesa da concorrência. Havia previsão expressa na nossa legislação de vários instrumentos que possibilitariam ao governo ser capaz de lidar com situações de crise como a da pandemia da Covid-19. E a principal medida era a Lei Delegada número 4, de 26 de setembro de 1962, uma lei elaborada no governo João Goulart, antes do golpe militar que instaurou uma ditadura de 21 anos no Brasil. O que dizia a Lei Delegada número 4? Ela dizia como que o governo poderia atuar para assegurar a livre distribuição de mercadorias e serviços essenciais ao consumo e uso do povo. Eram medidas excepcionais para o caso de crises de abastecimento. O Estado tinha o poder de comprar, armazenar, distribuir e vender, entre outros produtos, medicamentos, artigos sanitários e artefatos industrializados de uso doméstico e produtos e materiais indispensáveis à produção daqueles bens. Em caso de necessidade, o Poder Executivo poderia, inclusive, fixar preços e controlar o abastecimento, incluindo produção, transporte, armazenamento, desapropriar ou requisitar bens e serviços, sempre, obviamente, mediante indenização, e promover estímulos à produção, adquirindo, inclusive, bens e serviços no estrangeiro, se fosse necessário para garantir o abastecimento nacional. A Lei Delegada número 4, portanto, se institui uma série de políticas e de competências que permitia ao governo brasileiro lidar com crises graves como a crise da pandemia atual. No entanto, por motivos puramente ideológicos, de um liberalismo sem fundamento na realidade, o Brasil revogou a Lei Delegada número 4 em setembro de 2019, no ano passado, com uma lei chamada Lei da Liberdade Econômica, que revoga expressamente a Lei Delegada número 4, por motivo simplesmente de ser uma lei que permitia a atuação do Estado na esfera econômica. E qual foi a consequência dessa revogação? O Estado brasileiro não tem hoje qualquer parâmetro legal para atuação em momentos de grave crise econômica e social. As medidas foram previstas na Lei 13.979 de 2020, que é a lei da pandemia, elas não têm a mesma abrangência e não conferem a mesma possibilidade de atuação do Estado. Pelo contrário, elas são bem limitadas e restritas. A Constituição de 88, nesse sentido, assim como a Lei Orgânica da Saúde, elas determinam que o Estado brasileiro deve promover políticas econômicas e sociais para garantir o acesso à saúde a todos os cidadãos. E hoje o Estado brasileiro perdeu os mecanismos legais para tanto, por uma medida puramente ideológica. As políticas que o Estado brasileiro tem que atuar no serviço de saúde, elas são essenciais justamente para poder regulamentar, fiscalizar e controlar todo o processo e garantir o abastecimento e o acesso à saúde para todos. Hoje, vivemos uma situação de um Estado que está com as mãos amarradas, para além das crises federativas que o assolam, em que a União Federal hoje se recusa a atuar em conjunto com estados e municípios no Sistema Único de Saúde, no combate à pandemia. Vivemos hoje, além de tudo, uma crise federativa. Então, reestruturar o complexo industrial da saúde é possível e é necessário. A urgência dessas medidas de reestruturar o papel do Estado no combate às pandemias, no combate às crises e na elaboração de uma política industrial da saúde, ela é uma urgência que é absolutamente evidente. O Estado deve se tornar novamente o ente planejador e coordenador do processo econômico e das políticas sociais. O setor financeiro público, liderado pelo Banco Nacional de Desenvolvimento Econômico e Social, o BNDES, é o suporte de apoio e financiamento dessas medidas de reconstrução e reconversão industriais, além de outras medidas emergenciais que se façam necessárias, não podendo se limitar, como hoje, a injetar recursos no sistema bancário e deixar as indústrias, grandes, médias e pequenas, quebrarem e o desemprego e a miséria aumentarem juntamente com a crise da saúde pública. O papel do Estado e do direito econômico é um papel essencial para o combate à pandemia e o combate aos efeitos negativos das crises econômica e sanitária. O ponto-chave é que o direito econômico ele é essencial, ele tem função num Estado capaz de planejar, e é isso que o Estado brasileiro precisa retomar, sua capacidade de planejar e reestruturar os fatores de produção. Porque é com o Estado capaz de planejar, capaz de reestruturar o processo produtivo, capaz de combater a crise, que podemos reorganizar a nossa economia para poder enfrentar não só a crise, mas o período pós-crise, com o objetivo de construir um futuro em que seja possível voltar a buscar a superação do subdesenvolvimento. Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much, Professor Bercovici. We can open Q&A at this point. I see a question already, so I will not hesitate to read this question to you. The question is from Juliana Gack. Dear Professor Gilberto Bercovici, congratulations on your lecture. Is it possible for the Brazilian government to give proper answer to the pandemic when it comes to organizing Brazilian industrial complex, as restructuring or structuring the sector would take a significant time to occur? Or will we have to wait years, maybe decades, to properly deal with such a disease as COVID-19?
Bom, o Brasil, ele teve os meios, os instrumentos que possibilitariam a ele lidar com uma maneira relativamente rápida com a crise, e que poderia, inclusive, utilizar a crise como uma oportunidade para reestruturar o setor industrial da saúde, como outros países fizeram. O que aconteceu, infelizmente, é que o atual governo foi desmontando essas estruturas, foi revogando a legislação, foi alterando a legislação, e hoje precisaríamos primeiro reestruturar legalmente as capacidades do Estado para aí então ele poder começar a atuar. E o resultado, e isso deveria ter sido feito no início da pandemia. Nós estamos só correndo com já perdemos a corrida, na verdade, estamos correndo contra o tempo, né? A necessidade ela continua, mas já numa perspectiva com prejuízos muito maiores que poderiam ter sido evitados se essas medidas tivessem sido tomadas anteriormente, tanto em termos econômicos como em termos de salvar vidas. Vidas foram perdidas em virtude das políticas equivocadas que foram tomadas no Brasil, infelizmente. Mas o Estado brasileiro poderia, sim, ele teria ainda meios para tentar recuperar parte, pelo menos, do complexo industrial da saúde. O resultado dessa não retomada é que boa parte da nossa indústria de saúde, hoje ela é uma indústria importadora de implementos e de equipamentos, muito mais do que produtora. E ao ser uma indústria importadora, ela sofreu com uma série de eventos que todos vimos pela imprensa, como, por exemplo, o atraso no fornecimento de equipamentos, porque vinha a maioria da China como única produtora desses equipamentos. Parte desses equipamentos foi desviada, por exemplo, nos Estados Unidos ou na Europa, e acabou não chegando aqui, foram confiscadas nos países em que por onde passavam, né? Mesmo aqui, os equipamentos chegavam no Brasil e aí havia uma série de medidas judiciais de estados ou de prefeituras disputando esses equipamentos, na absoluta falta de uma coordenação federal. Então, houve uma série de conflitos e de problemas em virtude justamente da falta de uma política de combate à pandemia e da falta da coordenação federal. Acho que o grande problema no Brasil é a ausência da União Federal no combate à pandemia. A União Federal simplesmente não acredita na pandemia, acha que isso não existe, né? Essa vez as declarações do presidente da República, e ele não deixa ninguém da União atuar na coordenação e na colaboração federativa, o que gera uma série de problemas, inclusive de problemas judiciais em virtude disso.
Thank you. What you're saying about the federal government sounds familiar to me, and I live in another country, about lack of coordination and letting the individual states basically sometimes even competing with each other about how to deal with the pandemic. We have another question from Milena Ponchio, and the question is, how does the idea of public health, sorry, there is a typo probably, how is the idea of how important is the idea of public health to reestablish public structures to combat COVID? So the notion of public health in Brazil, I suppose, the question.
A importância da união, é isso?
The idea of public health. I suppose the question refers to the national public system.
Sistema único, sim. O Brasil, ele tem um modelo que é implantado em 88, mas que é fruto da luta de décadas, né, da ampliação da saúde pública universal. É um modelo parecido, talvez, com o inglês, né, da ideia de saúde pública universal. E, bem ou mal, com todos os problemas de recursos que a saúde pública enfrenta no Brasil, com os problemas de falta de equipamentos, ou às vezes até falta de pessoal, né, a pandemia não foi pior no Brasil, justamente pelo fato de termos um sistema de saúde público universal que conseguiu, de um jeito ou de outro, atender, na medida do possível, a maior parte das pessoas. Obviamente, há problemas, né? Mas se o sistema fosse um sistema não universal, não público, com certeza haveria muito mais mortes, haveria muito mais consequências trágicas em relação à pandemia. Então, o sistema público foi uma conquista brasileira da Constituição de 88 e cuja importância se ressaltou. É lógico, é um sistema que enfrenta, além da falta de coordenação, um ataque sistemático em relação aos seus recursos. Os professores estrangeiros não sabem, mas no Brasil foi aprovada, em 2016, uma emenda à Constituição Federal, limitando os investimentos em direito em políticas sociais, particularmente saúde e educação, mas não só, mas principalmente saúde e educação, por 20 anos. É o chamado teto de gastos, né, em que as verbas hoje que o sistema de saúde recebe são menores do que as verbas que recebia há 3 ou 4 anos atrás. Então, há uma limitação de recursos, há uma diminuição de recursos, e mesmo assim, o sistema conseguiu, de um jeito ou de outro, ainda enfrentar a pandemia da melhor maneira possível. Né? Poderia ter sido melhor? Sim, efetivamente poderia, caso houvesse mais recursos, caso houvesse uma coordenação. A falta de coordenação atrapalha também, porque, como o professor Daniele colocou, os estados ficam brigando entre si, disputam entre si, os municípios também. Então, ao invés de haver uma divisão de tarefas, acaba havendo uma confusão sobre quais tarefas e quais recursos vão ser utilizados em quais lugares. Mas, de um jeito ou de outro, apesar da falta da união, justamente por ter um sistema público universal, o Brasil está conseguindo lidar com a pandemia. Os números são muito altos de vítimas, mas poderia ter sido muito maior.
Thank you. I have one question from Bruno Bastos de Oliveira. And the question is, well, congratulations and thank you for the lecture. And the question is, how do you observe the issue of vaccine production and distribution, given this reality experienced by the health sector? It is yet another crisis installed by this lack of the federal coordination.
A questão da vacinação, o Brasil tem uma vantagem aí sobre outros países. Essa é a vantagem, talvez, do atraso. O Brasil está acostumado a fazer campanhas de vacinação das mais variadas doenças, né? Doenças que ainda existem aqui, infelizmente, mas que não existem em outros países, e aqui ainda existe a campanha de vacinação. Essa logística da campanha de vacinação, ela pode ajudar bastante quando for possível ter uma vacina contra a Covid, que parece que nos próximos meses será algo concreto. Agora, obviamente, a falta de coordenação federal atrapalha, mas como no caso da vacinação, os estados já sabem que não vão ter o auxílio da União, eles estão arranjando formas de cooperarem, de se coordenarem, independentemente do auxílio federal. Obviamente, o auxílio federal facilitaria muito e economizaria recursos, mas na ausência do auxílio federal, já há acordos entre alguns estados, já há conversas entre os próprios governadores e os secretários de saúde para uma articulação estadual, infranacional, para possibilitar a vacinação, que a vacinação atinja o maior número de pessoas no menor tempo possível. Como o Brasil tem essa experiência já de campanha de vacinação, acredito, né, que mesmo com a ausência federal, não vai haver um grande obstáculo a que essa vacina possa ser distribuída para a maior parte da população quando ela for concreta, quando ela for algo realmente seguro para ser utilizado.
Thank you. I have a question from Beatriz Nami. Apologies for my pronunciation. In a situation of demobilization or demobilization of sectors of the economy, as has been raised by several authors in the situation of COVID-19, how should we plan and execute this important planning? How can economic law guide this necessary path of replanning, if you...
Justamente o que agravou a crise econômica no Brasil é essa falta de planejamento. Porque o planejamento, isso que nem sempre as pessoas se dão conta, não é só para mobilizar no sentido da atuação em determinado sentido. A própria, o isolamento, a desmobilização de setores ou a paralisia de determinados setores, a diminuição de determinados setores, como, por exemplo, restaurantes, teatro, setor cultural, né? O comércio, de alguma forma, tinha que ter sido não só planejado, organizado, mas também com meios financeiros que possibilitassem a manutenção no maior tempo possível dos vínculos de emprego, para as pessoas poderem continuar tendo renda, e os próprios empresários ou proprietários, enfim, também poderem ter recursos para manter os seus negócios enquanto durasse a crise e pudessem reabri-los quando passasse a crise. Infelizmente, no Brasil, isso não ocorreu. No Brasil, ocorreram duas coisas na contramão de outros países. A primeira delas foi o governo liberou mais de R$1 trilhão para os bancos, para o sistema financeiro. E o sistema financeiro não facilitou o crédito, não ampliou o crédito para pequenos e médios empresários. Pelo contrário, ele dificultou o crédito. Isso fez com que várias empresas, vários negócios fossem obrigados a fechar suas portas, a encerrar as suas atividades, causando desemprego. E o Brasil também, ao contrário de outros países, não garantiu o vínculo trabalhista, o vínculo de emprego. Ao invés de o governo tentar manter, de alguma maneira, alguma renda para os trabalhadores ou compensar os empregadores, ela baixou uma série de medidas, né, que facilitavam a demissão ou facilitavam a diminuição da jornada de trabalho com diminuição de salário ou a suspensão do contrato de trabalho, né, que diminui também a renda, né, e não garantiram, fizeram contra a vontade do governo, a partir de uma decisão do Congresso, do Legislativo, um auxílio emergencial que vai durar 6 meses, né? Já foi cortado pela metade no mês passado, né? A partir de janeiro do ano que vem não há mais auxílio emergencial. Ou seja, as pessoas que perderam o emprego, que não têm renda, vão ficar à margem de qualquer ajuda do governo, não vão ter mais recurso nenhum. Então, simplesmente é um abandono da população, mas da população não só a população pobre, é de toda a população, né? Seja empresários, seja negociantes, comerciantes e os trabalhadores, e a população que não consegue emprego ou que vive em condições de miséria, completamente abandonada em termos de auxílio pelo governo federal, enquanto os bancos recebem recursos. Então, nós sabemos qual que é a prioridade, infelizmente, para o atual governo. O que é curioso, só para completar, porque o pagamento desse auxílio emergencial de 6 meses, né, que foi aprovado pelo Congresso Nacional, ele até contribuiu para que o governo aumentasse a sua aceitação, a sua popularidade, porque afinal ele estava ajudando, em tese, as pessoas. As pessoas não associavam que era o Congresso que tinha aprovado a lei e que o presidente tinha sido contra, mas sim o presidente ganhou popularidade com auxílio. E mesmo assim, ele está encerrando o auxílio e não está deixando nenhum tipo de programa no lugar, nenhuma outra forma de política no lugar.
Thank you. Do you think that the lack of coordination or the unwillingness to coordinate at the federal level or inability to coordinate at the federal level is resulting from pressures, and what kind of pressures? Do you think that more domestic factors are at play in this particular moment? Or do you think that global factors are more crucial to read this inability or unwillingness of the federal government to intervene and take control?
Eu acredito que são fatores domésticos. Há uma aposta política do atual governo em ser contra as medidas de combate à pandemia. É uma aposta política que, em parte, eles ganharam, porque parte da população incorporou o discurso anticientífico, entendendo que a pandemia não é um problema, que é uma doença fácil de se tratar, que é um exagero, e que, na verdade, não estão querendo deixar o presidente governar. Então, parte incorporou esse discurso, aceitou esse discurso. Outra parte, não, né? Eu acho que, passada a pandemia, e um dia ela vai passar, é o que todos esperamos, né? Haverá um acerto de contas político, sim. Porque aí sim, talvez as pessoas parem para pensar o que aconteceu, o que foi perdido, o que foi fechado, as vítimas, as pessoas não voltam mais, os empregos não voltam mais, os lugares que fecharam não vão reabrir de novo. Então, talvez sim as pessoas se deem conta da gravidade do impacto da pandemia, né? No momento, parte delas, infelizmente, não tem. Mas acho que são questões políticas internas. Lógico que o fato de ter, nos Estados Unidos também, um exemplo que ia na mesma direção, facilitava, né, para o atual governo usar esse discurso. Ele tinha uma legitimidade, entre aspas, né, porque ele não estava sozinho, né? Mas não foi por isso, não foi mera imitação ou influência, foi uma decisão, um cálculo político interno, sabe-se lá o motivo, enfim, um dia vamos descobrir, né, o que levou o presidente da República a ir por esse caminho completamente irracional.
Understand, thank you. I think we have time for one last question. This is from Amanda Salgado. Professor, the question is, do you believe that the default of coordination of the industrial health complex is a product of the planning crisis in Brazil? there is a cause and effect here kind of question.
Sim, assim, são duas coisas, na verdade. O Estado brasileiro vem perdendo os seus instrumentos de atuação, de planejamento, de organização de política econômica, política social, desde a década de 1990, desde o governo Fernando Henrique Cardoso. Vem sendo desmontados com o discurso neoliberal, de corte de gastos, de privatização. Isso é um processo. Esse processo foi parcialmente interrompido em 2003, com o governo Lula, e foi retomado de maneira muito acelerada a partir de 2016, depois do golpe que depois a presidente Dilma. O atual governo ele vem nessa linha de desmonte do Estado, de privatização, de liberalismo radical. Então, a gente tem um processo histórico de desmonte que já vinha dos anos 90, que é acelerado, que o atual governo continua. E, ao mesmo tempo, aliado a isso, nós temos, aí sim, um governo que cruzou os braços. Né? Nem o governo Fernando Henrique, com todos os defeitos que ele possa ter, ele não abandonou o SUS, o Sistema Único de Saúde, à própria sorte. Ele atuava dentro das suas competências legais. Não era a política que eles mais gostavam, mas enquanto era obrigação do Estado participar da organização do sistema de saúde, a União participava e ajudava os estados e municípios e coordenava os esforços. O que aconteceu foi, além do desmonte, do discurso de que o Estado não pode intervir, ou não pode atuar, ou não pode coordenar, houve o cruzamento deliberado de braços, assim, houve a paralisia deliberada. Né? Então, nesse sentido, também é culpa, embora seja um processo de desmonte, há um dado a mais, que foi a paralisia proposital, né, da coordenação de saúde, o que gera, né, todas as consequências. E a consequência, talvez todos estejamos percebendo, hoje se fala muito em segunda onda da Covid na Europa e talvez nos Estados Unidos. No Brasil não tem segunda onda, estamos na mesma onda. Não saímos da primeira onda. É uma coisa só. Né? Justamente por quê? Porque não conseguimos combater com toda a eficiência possível, porque falta a União, falta o governo federal como ente de coordenação dessas políticas.
Thank you very much, Professor Bercovici. We are, this is noon, New York time, and I think I am at the time in which I have to thank you, all the panelists, Professor Pistor, Professor Chang, and Professor Bercovici for your contribution. And I would like also to thank the staff, the support staff that helped me coordinating this panel. Thank you very much for your service and your translations. And I will give the stage to Clarice again. Thank you very much. Clarice, you're muted. Clarice, you're muted. You're
Sorry. Ok, desculpem. Bom, gostaria de agradecer imensamente à professora Katharina Pistor, ao professor Gilberto Bercovici, a toda a equipe que esteve aqui presente para possibilitar que nosso encontro iniciasse de uma maneira bastante proveitosa. Gostaria de agradecer a participação do Daniele como moderador e agradecer toda a equipe e informar que nós estaremos de volta às 15h30 do Brasil e 1h30 do horário de Nova York, nas salas. Aí nós vamos ter a divisão de salas, porque vamos ter a apresentação dos painéis. Então, se alguém da equipe quiser fazer um esclarecimento sobre o link de entrada, que é diferente do link das palestras gerais, eu agradeceria, para a gente poder instruir todos como é que o link pelo qual a gente volta, né? Então, à tarde nós vamos ter 2 painéis em que vão ser discutidos, vai haver apresentação de trabalhos, vai ter a sala 1 e a sala 2. A sala 1, nós vamos ter aqui, desculpa, eu estou com outro, Guilherme, Gabriela ou Felipe, ou Carol, poderiam fazer esse esclarecimento, por favor? Obrigada, Gabi.
Olá, professora, tudo bem? Eu vou falar em português, porque eu acredito que a maior parte da nossa plateia seja falante do português, mas nós enviamos para os e-mails dos apresentadores, os links, e também está disponível no nosso link do Event 3, todos os links para ingressos nas salas. Ao contrário do que aconteceu agora, nossa reunião de hoje foi pelo webinar, foi por esse formato, e as salas vão ser por meio de reunião de Zoom, que vão acontecer simultaneamente. Então, essas salas estão disponíveis no nosso site do Event 3, que está disponível, por sua vez, no link, no e-mail da nossa conferência, está disponível nas nossas redes sociais. Então, por gentileza, procurem nesses sites, nesses lugares que está disponível na internet. E, caso vocês tenham alguma dúvida ainda, podem mandar e-mail para o nosso e-mail da conferência, que nós vamos responder.
Então, tá ótimo, era isso mesmo, e o horário está confirmado, não é isso? É 1h30 dos Estados Unidos e 15h30 do Brasil. Prestem, por favor, atenção nos horários, né, para não haver confusão.
Exato.
E aí, agora eu acho que nós podemos encerrar agradecendo mais uma vez a participação de todos, a tradução simultânea da Raquel e do Otto, e o trabalho todo da equipe que está aqui, Gabriela, Felipe, Carol, Guilherme, fora os que estão lá no background, Vânia, quem mais que eu deixei de mencionar? Eu acho que eu mencionei agora, Amanda, que foi responsável aí por toda essa parte do site tecnológica. Então, voltaremos às 15h30 do Brasil e 1h30 do horário de Nova York. Podemos encerrar? Alguém gostaria de fazer mais algum comentário, esclarecer alguma dúvida? Então, estaremos de volta, então, daqui a pouco. Até logo. Felipe, vou pedir para o Felipe lembrar de encerrar, porque senão o Zoom entende que nós não fechamos, né? Não entende que é um outro participante, então precisamos fechar essa. Muito obrigada, Daniele. Thank you, Daniele, very much. Thank you, Professor Gilberto, Katharina. I think we are done for now. Thank you, Professor Gilberto, very much. We are going to have his text in our book. We are going to translate it to English, and you will be able to have it.